Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to the Housing and Environment Overview Scrutiny Committee this Thursday the 24th of January. If we move on to item 1, fire evacuation procedures. I'm looking around the table and seeing nobody here that doesn't know them already, but there are no fire alarms forecast, so anything that does go off is genuine, so please take note. Webcasting of meeting. It is webcast and you'll see the signs at the side, so be aware of that. 3, to receive apologies for absence. I have 2 apologies, Councillor Gavin James and Councillor Mrs Court. I'm looking around, no more, thank you. 4, resignations and replacements. I've not been notified of any. 5, declarations of conflict of interest or whipping decisions. I'm not aware of anything. 6, urgent items, nothing. 7, it's the longer one, to confirm the minutes, paper A. Councillor Mrs James.
Thank you. Can I ask on page 4 of 23, I asked for a written answer to whether the recommendation of an annual target to deliver at least 300 affordable homes was net or gross. I don't think I've had an answer to that yet.
Apologies, I don't believe you haven't had a written answer, but the answer is it's a gross target. I'm happy to confirm that in writing if that would help. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs James again.
And on the page 7 of 23, I asked requested officers to supply a graph detailing the increased rate of recycling. Did I receive that? I don't know if I did or not. I don't remember it if I did, but...
We have a whole list of papers here that were supplementary to the last minutes. We're just checking through. Bear in mind that was on waste and we're on a different issue tonight for the officer.
I believe that's it, Councillor James. I can send it again if that would be helpful. Yep, no problem. Oh, sorry.
Right, if everybody's happy with the minutes, thank you very much. We now move on to item 8, member and public participation. We have Mr Paul Beavers on paper B and Councillor Short on paper B. Still partly 8, but it's moving on to 9. We have the portfolio holder present, Councillor Donnell. Do you wish to speak now?
It's actually Councillor Watts who reminded me to do this on the way in, so you can blame yourself, Gary. We have been experiencing very adverse weather in the last week or so, and I thought it's appropriate for this committee, hopefully, to join with me and to thank our council staff and the way they've coped with it. The street cleaning team have been out from midnight, 2 a.m. in the morning, keeping the top of town clear. The bin crews have been going out. We've had extra crews from Viola. They've really been doing a sterling job. I think it's appropriate this committee says thank you to them. That was all, Mr. Chairman.
I believe the whole committee endorses that. Could it please be noted in the minutes? Thank you. Because my bins have certainly been emptied on time correctly. I hope everybody else's has. Yes. Right, that's 8 and 9 done. 10, referrals from other committees, there are none. And 11, the cabinet issues, there are none. So the major part of tonight's is item 12. One minor bit of information to give you. Mr Paul Beavers, who's speaking on this one, is also partly the item 13 as well. But that we will come to that when we come to it. But if you remember who he is when he does 12, that's the man for 13. Right. Paper B. Would the officers like to introduce it?
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm Paul Johnston, leader of the Natural Environment team. I'm here presenting this paper along with my colleague Margaret McGrath, who's the Parks and Open Spaces Development Officer, who has been key in developing the standards that we're looking to adopt. This report follows an earlier draft which was considered by this committee back in November 2011, setting out proposals for revised green space standards to be adopted by the Council for use in the emerging local plan and green infrastructure strategy. The report responds to comments, this report responds to comments made by that committee and also to comments received as part of a consultation exercise carried out between February and March 2012. The comments include seeking clarification on the application of town and rural standards in different areas, confirmation that the expected standard will be the starting point of any negotiations, and also clarifications of some definitions. It's recommended that the standards are adopted as the Council's standards for the provision of green space and are used in the emerging local plan and green infrastructure strategy. That the maximum distance thresholds for multifunctional green space, equipped play areas are used, that the minimum sizes and quantity standards for multifunctional green space, parks, equipped play areas, allotments, and also that the expected quantity standards are met for multifunctional green space. And overall, we're looking to get a provision of green space that's appropriate for particular sites and at least as good as the existing standards. It's noted that the committee's comments will be included in a report to Cabinet seeking adoption of the final standards. Thank you.
I would normally at this stage go to Mr Paul Beavers and Councillor Shaw, unless anybody wishes me to deviate. Mr Beavers, would you like to come forward? And unless there's a lot of opposition, I propose to give Mr Beavers two options, one now and perhaps come back later if there's any issues, because I believe he's fairly well genned up on this subject.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm actually not going to waffle on for too long. I've sent out a note of my comments on the report that Paul's referred to, and rather than try and explain it, I've tried to explain my reasons in the notes that I've put out. I think there are 3 points I would like to make. The first thing, I would like to reinforce the fact that the MPPF does make very clear that it expects to see a balance in all forms of planning between economy, society and environment. And obviously we would include natural environment in that, and we feel it does not receive the level of importance by this council that it should. And that's been reinforced, in fact, recently in a report to government from a parliamentary committee, and the government's reinforced that approach, that it wants to see that through planning. The second point I would like to make is that also the MPPF makes clear, and the government has made clear in its response to a committee report, that it is not trying to specify everything about what should happen in the natural environment and what local authorities should do. It's effectively devolved decision making to you. It gives you the opportunity to apply your own rules and judgments so that we don't have to depend on a tick box culture, which is not actually very good from government when it comes to biodiversity management. So you have a lot of latitude that's given to you by the MPPF, and I hope you will seize it, because we've not had it in the past. And then finally, there are some comments that were made on the report, or at least were submitted by an estate agent on behalf of a developer, which prompted a question in my mind. They were alluding to the fact that it ought to be possible basically for open space to accommodate more people if there was good provision around. I represent Old Down and Beggar Wood, and I'd be interested to know when we're going to determine that a site is overcrowded, especially if it's got biodiversity value, which those two sites have. So, for example, we have skylarks on both those sites, and they're hanging on by a thread. And there are not many places where skylarks can exist now. So, at what point do we say we've got more than enough people using that site, and we should provide for more people, more space? Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Presumably you're happy to stay for the meeting. Thank you. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to speak on paper B and particularly raise the issue of a problem with the policy that's recommended to you as it's currently written. The background to this was contained really in the report that you had back in November 2011, because that referred specifically to the deficiency of open space in the ward of Brookvale and Kings Furlong, which I represent, and that particular report referred, as you may recall, to the fact that in Brookvale and Kings Furlong there's 8 metres squared of open space for each resident, and that actually compares unfavourably with many other areas across the borough, and it also compares particularly unfavourably with the sort of standard that is being spoken about in this report of 65 metres squared per person. And the problem that I have is that on planning applications, and I'm thinking specifically of a planning application that was approved and has now been built in Sinclair Drive in Brookvale and Kings Furlong. What happened with that particular planning application was that it was argued in the officer report that came before Development Control that it was reasonable not to have the standard of open space on that particular development site, but instead to receive a developer contribution in cash form towards provision elsewhere. And the way in which that developer contribution has subsequently been identified, it's been identified for improvements in existing parks nearby. And that's all fine, but it doesn't actually provide the green space that we're trying to achieve through this whole process. In fact, it makes the existing deficiency in green space worse than it was before. I support what's actually identified as the purpose of this green standard, which is to ensure access to good quality open space for all borough residents. But the problem is that the sections and the content which is sort of headed up as flexibility of quantity standards on page 10 of 15 or page 18 of 23 in your agenda, the effect of some of the wording in sections there will be basically to worsen green space provision in areas that already lack it. So I'd really ask you to forward that comment on to the portfolio holder from this committee. He's in the audience this evening, which I welcome, and I hope that he's listening carefully to what I say. And he has said in the background that he is always listening to me, so that's really welcome to hear. I hope that he'll act, and that you will recommend him to act to change the wording of these flexibility clauses so that we don't on future applications get a situation that actually worsens rather than improves the provision of green space in our local areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll now open up to the councillors for questions. Councillor Mrs. James.
Can I ask John a question?
In this instance, yes.
John, in relation to the report on page 14 of 23, it relates to what you were asking. It's 4.4 of the report. It says comments were also made relating to the application of standards in different site situations. The following is proposed in response. Is your concern around the word in addition or instead of provision of new green space? So this is where we can mitigate, and maybe you could talk us through that section a bit more, because obviously I have concerns and have experienced that in my own water. Maybe that's where you want to talk to us about.
Yes, thank you very much, Councillor James. Yes, it is indeed the issue that, if you look at that particular wording in section 4.4, it's this, reference to, opportunities to improve existing green space, instead of provision of new green space. Because what's the point of actually having a standard and saying we want 65 metres squared, per person, if we don't actually then use that policy to actually, get that, achieve that objective of the actual quantity of open space. So it is that particular sort of phraseology that I have difficulty with. And I think it's a very real concern because, there are adjacent housing sites that are identified in the council's strategic housing land availability assessment, that adjoin that site that I've referred to, where there is a very real and present risk, if we simply adopt this policy as it's indicated here, that we will get a deficiency and a worsening in the availability of open space in the local area.
Thank you. I'll ask the officer if you'd like to actually make some comments on that.
That one. Yeah, I mean, basically, what I would say is that it's definitely not our intention that we would end up with worse provision than we've currently got. The standards are based around at least maintaining the provision that we have, which is more than the old standard was actually requiring. So we're trying to get closer to what we currently have. And I certainly accept Councillor Shaw's point that Brookvale is particularly poorly served in terms of green space, and a lot of that obviously is historic in terms of the type of development that it is. In terms of, I suppose in some ways it's talked of as a sort of trade-off between on-site and off-site provision. My view is I would never see it in that way. My view is initially to always try and get open space provision on site. The times when you would look to take an off-site contribution would be if the quantity of open space related to that development was so tiny, it just wouldn't fulfil any recreational purpose, and it would simply, just have no real value, other than, visual value, but in terms of recreational space, which is what these standards are referring to, it might be so small that it just wouldn't meet the function. So that would be one reason. And that will be the initials. I suppose that would be the initial start in terms of where do I now look for, somewhere that we could take an off-site contribution for, and then the issue comes in with distance criteria. If there are existing open spaces within the area that can accommodate the additional residents, subject to some enhancement, then I would take an off-site contribution for that. So, I mean, in the original, I don't know if anybody's got the original report with them that went in November, but there was a section in there under conclusions which tries to set out the scenarios basically of when we would take an off-site contribution, when we would look for on-site provision. And I mean, I suppose probably the first point there, for infill regeneration within Basingstoke Town, it would normally be appropriate to use the quantity standard to calculate the amount of financial contribution a developer should make towards the enhancement of existing provision within appropriate distance thresholds. And I think this is probably what Councillor Shaw is concerned about. But I think that is very much a sort of practical approach to a situation where, short of demolishing houses and creating new open space, we don't have the capacity to create a large-scale new open space. And if it's only a small development, say half a dozen houses, the actual requirement in terms of standard will mean that if you tried to provide it on site, either the development would be unviable or the open space would be unviable. So it's a sort of getting a balance between what would work on site, what the opportunities are off site, and the flexibility approach is really designed to try and get the very best open space provision that's as accessible as possible to the new development, and which is why it doesn't need to be flexible. In the past we've had a very rigid approach. With a flexible approach that gives us the opportunity to weigh up all these different options and try and come up with the best solution.
Thank you. Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. If I could just ask Paul Johnson a question. I mean, when you were talking about the minimum standards, you made the statement that you thought they were at least as good as the existing standards. That doesn't sound terribly ambitious. One might hope that the minimum standards would be rather better than the existing standards.
That's what I meant to say. Yes, we're looking for minimum standards that are better than the existing ones.
But am I right in thinking that the standards that you're proposing as the minimum standards here are not much better than the existing standards? That's what the statement seemed to imply.
No, they are in fact better than the existing standards.
Councillor Mrs James.
Thank you. I've got lots of questions. My first question is that this green space standard is going to inform part of the new development in the local plan. I just wonder why it hasn't, and I think it should, have gone to P&I, as it's going to inform that local plan. And that's my first question. Why is it at this committee and not at P&I?
As Chairman, I think if I put my view on, this is looking at the ideal situation, what we want for green areas, for wildlife as well as humans. And we're not looking at planning legislation. We're not looking at the depth of footings. We're not looking at any of that lot issue. We are looking at green areas for the borough.
Thank you, Chair, for your comments, but I'm asking the officers. What I'm saying is this is informing policy in relation to the local plan. We have, in relation to affordable housing, that policy went to, even though this is housing and environment, went to P&I. I just wonder why this is here and not at P&I. That's my first question.
Okay. As far as these standards are concerned, these relate to the standards that the council wants to adopt. And as far as I'm aware, this is a correct committee for that to be taken to in terms of adoption.
Thank you. So in relation to my second question, I think it's and I want to pick it up. It's in relation to what John Shaw spoke about, and I'm just going further in relation to the officer and what they came back to on page 14 of 23, 4.4, and building in flexibility. Within Norden, we have a shortfall of open space, and what this is now saying is that when new development takes place, opportunities to improve existing green space in surrounding areas will be considered in addition to or instead of. My concern is, or if I could just ask the officer, in relation to if we use the old Lemon Land application as an example, they didn't meet the requirement, and then they offered to mitigate that in relation to and offered to do improvements to the cemetery and call that open space. We have a lack of capacity in Norden. It wasn't going to give us any more. And my understanding from the officer, Giorgio, at the time is that development should consume its own smoke. But what we're doing here is in building in this flexibility, particularly at a time of viability, I think, are we leaving ourselves vulnerable? And what would happen in an example of going back to the Lemon Land? Why would it be different here? Because now, if you look at the policies around viability under 106, there's real get out. So I think that we're going to see mitigation or offer of mitigation to offer a couple of goalposts or something on a site, an existing site, and not building. You can't build capacity if we don't have it. But we're going to have further brownfield development with no open space.
I think what we've tried to do is we've tried to have standards. I mean, at the moment we only have a quantity standard that we can really apply. We have advisory distance criteria, but not for every type of open space. So what we've tried to do here is to try and close some of those discussions that I've had with developers in the past by being very clear about distance thresholds. So, to say, like on the Lemon Land, to say, well, we'll provide kickabout as an off-site contribution at Whiteditch, for example, that wasn't accepted then, and it definitely wouldn't be accepted now, and I think the standards are much more robust in my ability to resist that, because the distance between the development and the proposed site would, just doesn't meet the requirements of the user of that type of green space. That's being provided for children. You can't expect them to travel, that distance. So my feeling is that these have made it tighter and provided us with additional standards to fill some of the gaps of the previous standards that we had. And with Lemon Land, they wouldn't, in an example like that, they wouldn't be able to get away with building that size of development without on-site open space. There would be no, from my point of view, and I think that's the other thing I need to be clear, from my point of view, as Parks and Open Spaces consultee, my view would be that a development of a size that generates a quantity of open space that is manageable as open space and usable as open space, it should be provided on site. The only time that you would look for an off-site contribution would be, usually it's the case that it's too small a development, so, to having 10 square metres of green space within the development site just doesn't help anybody really. So it would be better to try and take an off-site contribution to enhance what's already there. That's the usual reason. The other reason might be that you've got adjacent existing open space within the distance threshold. There's already a deficiency in quality in that open space, which is impacting on existing residents as well. So there's almost an opportunity to try and address, the needs of the new residents and the needs of existing residents. So it's trying to sort of take all those into account and try and come up with the best solution for new and existing residents in terms of the location of the provision.
I've got lots of questions. I can come back. I'll go through some. If I can turn to page Appendix 1, I think it's page 17. The proposed green space standard for adoption. I think it was asked by Councillor Goddison about, and I picked it up as well. In your presentation, you talked about that. Paul said at least as good as. In his presentation, and I'd like to, in relation to the first standard, maximum distance threshold, under the old standard, the first one, which was multifunctional green space made up of, it did say 5 minutes, but the distance that you had to walk was 150 metres. Whereas now it's 5 minutes and it's 350 metres walking. So that's not quite fair, Paul, in your presentation. So it is less than. So what you've got to do now is you just got to walk a lot faster to get to the space in that time. So you've got to walk double the distance in the 5 minutes. That's my first question. I've got lots of questions on this table, but that
Margaret has been involved in the development of all these standards, so I'll get her to respond to that if that's okay.
Yes, the distance, the 5-minute walking distance has increased to 300, as you say, from 150, which is in the current SPD. But the reason for that, it's come out of the work that we had done as part of the Leisure and Recreation Needs Assessment, which basically informed the report in November 2011. And basically, the 300-metre walking has been derived from research into, national research into sort of distances that people are prepared to walk, but also comparisons with other local authorities who've done market research on how far people are prepared to walk to different facilities. And so that's believed to be a more accurate evidence-based figure and current figure than the previous one.
In relation to the accessible, on the same table on maximum distance threshold, accessible natural green space, it's 10 minutes for 60 meters walking. Was that not 5 minutes on the previous threshold? And also, can I ask, in relation to one of the respondents in the back of the page, Hampshire County Council talks about the standard produced by Natural England called Accessible Natural Green Space, and recommends that everyone, wherever they live, should have accessible natural green space. And they talk about no more than 300 metres and a 5-minute walk. So we're 100% out in that, and I wonder why, there's a national recommendation there, why as is such a large area, large distance to walk to one of these natural spaces, and why we haven't sort of taken on board that.
Yes, we're certainly aware of the Natural England Accessible Natural Green Space Standard, and it was something that was considered as part of the Leisure and Recreation Needs Assessment and as part of developing these standards. I think what I would say is that we've gone for this term of multifunctional green space because you're right that the English Nature Standard says that everybody should be within 300 metres of a natural green space, and that is what we're trying to achieve in that the minimum distance is 300 metres, so everybody has to be within 300 metres of some kind of multifunctional green space. Now that may, if it depends what the needs are in that area, that may be kickabout, it may be accessible natural green space, but then equally if we have a kickabout space, there's no reason why that can't be combined with accessible natural green space. So these are sort of maximum distance standards, and there's no reason why we can't say, well actually, because of the lack of accessible natural green space in this area, we want you to provide informal play space with a accessible natural green space as part of it, surrounding it, as part of its design.
And I understand and I know how committed you are to open space, but it doesn't say that, and it leaves us incredibly vulnerable. I don't think, that isn't what it's saying. In relation to that multifunctional green space, in those two distances, the first one we've reduced it down, and the second one against a national target is much greater. If I can go on to the issue that you picked up earlier on, you talked about that you're, as a professional officer, you would be consulted on developments and your view will be taken into consideration, and it's really in relation to the equipped play areas, which is the next one down. And I've got the example and I've printed it off for everybody. If I could just hand this round. But it's in relation to an application where you objected to that application because it didn't meet the requirement, a recent application. And in that application, our officers from planning used the Fields in Trusts, which is a national playing fields association, as a reason to offer a lower standard. And in offering that lower standard and a justification, and you had said you didn't support this application for material consideration because it didn't meet the criteria, and planning went against you and your professionalism, even though that would have been a material consideration, and said that they wanted that they accepted wanted acceptance of this application against your advice, and we ended up where the application was over half of what was required under our old standard. Now, in looking at this, because even under the Fields in Trusts requirement for walking, if you look up the application, and I looked at that, they say set the benchmark for walking distance is 400 metres to a leap, or 250 straight line walking distance. So isn't that third line on that table again less than a national requirement? But I also would like you to tell me why it would be different under this standard as to what, for you've given advice. Why would, in relation to that application and what people have got there, because it's so radically less than what we wanted as in our policy. We have a policy that says we want this. You're trying to work to that, but an officer somewhere else in another department has said, oh yeah, but nationally you can do less because they're doing it less nationally. Why would it be different under these standards than new standards? There's two questions there. Sorry.
Yes, I mean it's interesting that you raise this Fields in Trust standard, because I think that's part of the reason that we're anxious to get some kind of steer, if nothing else, or agreement to these standards from members, because the local plan standard I'm frequently being told is out of date, and therefore developers say that we shouldn't be using it. So they then revert to a national standard, which NPPF doesn't necessarily support. They say that we should be developing our standards locally based on local evidence, so that they're more relevant to the situation. So we shouldn't really be using the national standard. So we need to develop our own standard that we can then use in those situations, rather than being pushed to use the national standard. And in terms of quantities, the big issue with that development was that the first phase would have ended up with half as much quantity of provision as the current standard. And that's why I wasn't happy to accept that, because the argument was that phase 2 would make up for it, but I didn't know when phase 2 was going to happen, and there was no guarantee. So the principal objection was, well, this is phase 1 and you're not providing adequate open space. Now, under these standards, I'd be asking for more open space, in relation to that phase potentially. So in terms of quantity, potentially we'd be asking for more. In terms of distances, I accept that we've had a standard that says 150 to leaps and neeps. And that, that Fields in Trust talks about 420 and 250, I think. But the way that we've approached it, and this was also set out in the LRNA and the previous report, is that we're trying to provide multifunctional green space as close as possible to everybody that we can manage. And then in terms of the equipped play, so that equipped play, we can have bigger sites in more strategic locations, so we can spend more, make them better. And therefore the sort of informal play, rather than equipped play, the more informal play is the multifunctional green space, and that should be close to housing. I mean, the previous standard for the walking distance, I mean, that was a lot less than the Fields in Trust standard. So my view is that, I keep harking back to the sort of 300 metres to a green space. To me, that means that green space has to have value in terms of informal play, recreation, wildlife access as much as we can possibly achieve at that 300-metre walking distance.
Last one for the moment. 'Cause we
Okay,
have a-
okay, that's fine. Thank you. But in relation to, and I thank you for answering in relation to that application. But why would, and I understand your professional opinion is that this would give us more. But in relation to that application, as an example, I think it's good to have an example. It says within the report, whilst it is accepted that the proposal does not accord with the local plan standards in terms of the distance threshold, the development would accord with the FIT, which is the Fields in Trust standards, being within the benchmark distances set out for children to walk to equipped play areas. We have a standard as a borough, and we want standards as members. How can we ensure that officers in other areas, so in planning, actually, if we say this is what we want, adhere to that, instead of saying, but there is a national standard or is another standard somewhere else, we can accept less than half. How can we ensure that you, as a professional person who's saying that this is what we want, which is great, but how can we then ensure, because that's what we're all buying into, and I think we've got cross-party support that we want to protect, or we want as much open space as possible, that then that is adhered to in this standard. And I don't know that this is going to do this for you. I don't think it is robust enough to ensure that.
I think that it will be going to P&I as well, this report. So in terms of how, yes. So, in terms of how it impacts on planning. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I'm wrong there.
With P&I bit of backlog, I'm not sure this is actually going to go there, is it?
In terms of how, obviously, what we're doing in terms of green space standards and the green infrastructure strategy are basically documents that inform the local plan process. So, obviously, the difficulty is that the local plan process has had to be delayed, and so we haven't managed to get that confirmation in planning terms of the adoption of these as, planning policy so far. So that hasn't, although obviously we've been discussing it with planning officers. But yes, until the local plan is finalised, these standards won't be planning policy. So, and that's just the issue that we have with the local plan delay.
Just following up on that before you
Hang
go
on,
to
we have some clarification on that point.
Hello, sorry. I just want to clarify a point that obviously these green space standards are closely linked to the green infrastructure strategy, and the green infrastructure strategy itself, which will incorporate these, will be going to P&I in May, so they will get considered as part of that.
Thank you on that. And but this will be adopted at Cabinet before. So the standards which will inform the green infrastructure strategy will already have been adopted before the green infrastructure, and that's my concern, that this informs the green infrastructure strategy, and so therefore it should also go to P&I, and I request it to do so because it's going to inform that, and you're going to adopt these before the strategy has been adopted. So it's part and part. So, but in relation to what you're saying, Margaret, is under the old local plan, I know it was out of date, but we had a standard as councillors that we wanted to work to. But on that application, as an example, another department, against your professional opinion, said, we don't, you may say that we should turn this down because it isn't, because you were saying it wasn't fit under your professional opinion, but they didn't listen to that. And our old standard, they've offered less than half of what was required under the old standard. And they gave, as an example of that, to do that, a national organisation that allowed them to do that. And so I can understand that we haven't adopted these new ones, but even under the old standard, it said we was meant to deliver X, and under that application, it was less than half of what we should have done. How are we going to ensure that's not going to happen in the future? Is it, or will it still happen?
I mean, in the longer term future, we can prevent it happening by having the standards adopted as part of the local plan process and planning policy. And then that is what, as far as I understand it, the development control officers will be working to. So we have our own adopted local standard, and that's what we use as the basis. It may be challenged externally if it's not exactly the same as a national standard, but I think that we're fairly confident that we've got a lot of evidence that we've used to produce these standards that we think we can argue the case that these standards are better than the national standard. And that national standard specifically says that it's just guidance and they expect local authorities to develop their own local standards. In terms of my advice in planning applications and what results from that, I mean really that's just, I mean that is the planning process. Obviously I'm one of many people who are making comments about an application. And planning officers then have to balance all the various constraints and requirements and make a decision on balance as to what they think is acceptable.
We'll just have a few other. Councillor Baker, you had your hand up earlier.
Yes, thank you. Also have a few. When these standards or our standards get incorporated into the local plan, will there be narrative that clarifies how the flexibility would be applied? Because I think we all have the same concern that that where we have published minimums as well as published expected standards, and I think we talked about this last year as well. It is worrying that we may only ever end up with the minimum standard because we have published what our bottom line is in our negotiating position. So that's one issue. Normally, it's the it's only the bold type in the planning documents that has real weight, even though the narrative is there. So how can we get round that, and how can we try and ensure that we always do get an increment in the quantum of green space when any development comes forward? I've got a few more questions, so shall I just run through them all fairly quickly, Chairman? Or yeah?
Yes, please.
Then it's on again back to the table of proposed standards. The issue about the 50% reduction in rural areas, because although you may have green fields surrounding the rural area, they're not always accessible. If they've got footpaths on them, you still doesn't mean you can let your dog run around on them. You can't take your children there for a picnic or have a kick around. So you can't assume that you can make the same use of green space surrounding a rural area that you can of an urban park. So, why 50%? Why not 60%? Is there a justification for that? And I think this was a point that Mr. Beavers raised. How do we assess the capacity of green infrastructure to accommodate additional use? And this again relates back to the flexibility, because that's on page 18 of 23 is one of the phrases that's used in how the flexibility will be applied. Uh, and perhaps I think we might need a little bit more clarity on the circumstances in which you can count land that's been being used as a buffer, perhaps between two developments, as multifunctional green space, because most of those buffer areas that I can think of are the last thing you want is actually for people to start using them as multifunctional green space. So, do we perhaps need to clarify that? And that again is on page 18 of 23. Maybe more later, but
I'd like to have a chance at responding.
Hello. Certainly, we would expect that as this develops through the local plan, that the key part of it will be the narrative. So, in order to make it that flexibility clearer, would certainly something that we'd intend to include within that. So, yes, that's how we aim to do it.
I think in a sense what I'm looking for is text that will make flexibility less flexible.
Did you want to go through any of the other questions?
The difference between the rural and the town standard, as you say, this did come up at the last meeting, yeah, and we said that we would put it out to consultations, see what kind of response we got. We didn't actually get anything that was specifically about this issue, and therefore that's why we've presented it again. We haven't made that change with this report and with the proposed standards. The background to it, the reason for a different standard is that the expected standard is based on what the current level of provision is in the town and in the rural areas, and effectively has said, well, everybody in the survey said that what they'd got at the moment they wanted to keep, and they wanted it to be at least as good as that. So that was our sort of benchmark, that we should at least be continuing the sort of quantity per thousand that we currently have in these different areas. And in the rural area, the quantity of open space per thousand is lower than it is in the town. And I accept your point that, the assumption that, well, it's okay because everybody's got access to the countryside isn't often the case, and access is often restricted. But what I believe is that with the standard that we're suggesting for rural areas, we will be providing the more formal stuff. We will be providing the parks, the kickabout, the play areas will be that element. Accessible natural green space, we might say, well, if there is a public footpath that takes you out into the countryside that's accessible from this development, then that's acceptable as accessible natural green space. If there isn't, we would still expect you to provide that accessible natural green space. But I think, the main reason it's a different value is because the values reflect what's already there and the nature of the different developments. If we're honest, that obviously the town, if you're in the centre of the town, you've got a lot less access to green space than if you're in the centre of a village. So that's the rationale anyway.
Thank you. Councillor Tilbury.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I can ask the officers on it's on the same basis. So if you look at the minimum sizes, they're obviously in the rural areas. You suggested a larger size to allow for the fact that you probably won't get such big sites. So that makes sort of sense because you'll have to if you're going to have 50 hours instead of 200, to get even any part, it's going to have to be a bit bigger. But when you then come to the bottom on the parks at the bottom of the page, you're looking at 32 metres square per person in the rural areas, whereas it's 65 in or adjacent to the town. So it's going the other way. So what's the logic there? That's the first.
Yes, I think the issue around equipped play areas particularly is that within Basingstoke, the intention would be to have maybe half a dozen strategic play areas. So they will be really big scale play areas. And that would be part of that provision, which is what it refers to in terms of square meterage within the town. In the rural settlement, I think it's accepted that it's going to be almost impossible to produce that type of strategic facility, and therefore the play areas that we do provide should actually be bigger than the ones in the town. If you imagine the local play area in the town will be smaller than, because it's got the strategic facility as well, whereas in the rural area there's no strategic facility, so each play area we think should be bigger. You know, the local play areas should be bigger to compensate for the lack of the big scale facilities. So that's the reason for that. And yeah, and except it looks as if it's the other way around for the rest, but yeah, that's the reason for that. It's about the sort of size of the play areas and their functionality in those different environments, and the fact that in the town you will have strategic facilities that will have these bigger pieces of equipment, whereas in the town, in the rural areas, yeah, you'd probably have the bigger stuff within the more local, so you need them to be a bit bigger. So that's trying to sort of address that issue.
The other one I noticed on there, it sort of mentions it. Obviously, it came up because it's on the comments from the housing this committee from November of 2011. I think I was on this one then, but it's about Old Basing being classed as part of Basingstoke, not part of the rural area. But that was a comment from this seems to have come from the committee, and it's obviously referred to in the body of the report. But it's saying it's directly linked to Basingstoke, which from our discussions the other night at P&I is seriously bad news, isn't it? But it's I don't think it's Old Basing as I know. I didn't actually used to live there, but is one bit. Lichpit is attached to me is part of Chinham. I mean, I know technically it comes under Old Basing from that sort of things, but it's but Old Basing is quite separate, and Lichpit is sort of joined to Chinham, and Chinham's joined to the town, and so it does. I just wondered where that came from. Clearly, it's come out from this previous committee, but I don't know who raised it. Whether it was, I can't imagine it was the ward councillor suggesting it, but it's obviously someone did. If they could.
Yes, I have noticed it. Councillor Goddison, did you want to add to that?
I would just make the point that I've got no problem with that. I mean, obviously Basing likes to consider itself as being a village, but we are highly urbanised with Basing and Lichpit together, so I don't have any problem with us being given the standards which would apply to urban areas as opposed to rural areas.
Councillor Goddison, you were the next on the questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor James did actually ask the question that I was going to ask, but if I could just throw in a general comment. It seems to me rather pointless to have sort of expected standards and minimum standards. As Councillor Baker has indicated, we all know perfectly well that the standards which are going to be looked at by developers are the minimum standards, and therefore it's very essential that we have the minimum standards which we consider to be adequate, and that they are made as mandatory as it's possible to make such standards mandatory. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Peach.
Thank you. Just on the page 9 of 50 or 17 of 23 on the appendix, I just wanted to clarify, just perhaps from your own mind, on the minimum quantity standard boxes. It has the 3 sections to it: multifunctional, equipped play areas, and allotments. If you look at development, would you look at them as and, or is it or? Right. Okay. So we'd end up with a total figure. Okay. That's good. Okay, I've got a couple more questions. That's all right. Following on from some of the discussion that's come out of today, if we maintain the provision of a minimum standard, and we build a site like Shakespeare in Popley, where it's sort of quite locked in the middle of an already very dense area, so it's picking up from your point earlier about if there physically is no space to provide anything meaningful, then it would go elsewhere. I think again it's about that robustness of making sure that we have the ability to maintain sort of steadfast in our approach, that there should still be a minimum amount of land put somewhere for that local community, as opposed to a minimum amount of space put somewhere else in the borough perhaps. And I guess that's also around, you know, if a developer offers a cash alternative, that money perhaps is preserved under its Section 106 funds. I just feel that we need to try and make sure that if it can't happen here, then the nearest possible area should be improved in that local community.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely support that, and that's part of the reason for the distance criteria, is to sort of make the case that, you know, if we're taking an off-site contribution for, you know, multifunctional green space kickabout parks, it has to be accessible from the development, because we're taking it because of those individuals. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly the approach that I take.
Councillor Peach, the last one, or?
No, because a lot of the questions have been asked already, and it was just really about making sure that, you know, that we can get this really locked into the planning application, so that we don't end up in a situation where you have a planning application that can override the good intentions of this strategy. I'd see the two; they have to work together. And if we say it's 65 metres squared, then that's exactly what we're expecting, not for the developer to be able to renegotiate and reduce that space.
Thank you. Councillor Watts, you are next.
Thank you, Chair. Touching on what Councillor Shaw and Councillor James mentioned about the surveys, ward by ward, for the green space surveys, I just wonder where we can get that information for, and what paper it actually went, well, what committee actually went on. And the question would be, was it taken in just specifically in those individual wards, or was it including green spaces adjacent to those wards?
Be interesting, this.
Yeah, I mean, the information in terms of the assessment of the current green space that we have was included in the Green Infrastructure Strategy that came to this committee in 2011 again, I think, or was it early 2012? But so that information is there, and that's what went out to consultation, so that we could, you know, address any areas where there was green space that we weren't aware of, or that, you know, other people felt that they wanted included. So that information will all be collated and revised and attached to the revised Green Infrastructure Strategy, which will be coming back to this committee in May. So that information is available, and I'm sure, you know, we can make, you know, specific areas available if councillors, you know, wanted to have a look at a particular location. It's a very good point about not using, you know, not sort of having a cut off at ward boundaries. Obviously people don't know where they are, and they're not going to turn around and come back just because they've hit a ward boundary. So I think, you know, we're very conscious that we need to take account of our view is it's distance criteria. You know, we did an assessment on ward by ward basis, because that helps us to identify where some of the deficits may be. We can then focus in on those and say, well, is it actually a deficit, or is there actually a large lump of open space, you know, in the adjacent ward that we need to take account of? And I think it's not just wards, I think it's, you know, on the edge of the borough as well. We're very aware that, you know, we may be saying that there's a deficiency in somewhere in the northwest of the borough, but in fact just across the borough boundary there's something that can meet that need. So yeah, we do need to be looking widely in terms of how we approach that.
Supplementary, obviously I'm thinking about South Ham. In the SLAR document, there's proposals for 100 homes at Downgrange and Pack Lane, which is adjacent to South Ham Ward, but it's actually in Kempshot Ward. But the knock-on effects of that is obviously going to be affected in South Ham Ward. If there was a planning application that went forward, which ward would you use? Would you use the Kempshot Ward as for 65 metres per squared, or would you use the South Ham Ward for the 65 metres per squared? And obviously I think that's really important, because obviously Kempshot's got the whole of Downgrange in its area, and we haven't got do you class Downgrange in South Ham, or do you class it in Kempshot? So when we're getting down to the nitty gritty of a planning application, I think it needs to be pretty watertight, really, especially when we were taking valuable green space away, which is proposed in the SLAR document. And going on about the minimum and expected standards, I don't know why we just don't have the expected standard as our policy of 65 metres, give the developers no wriggle room, basically, to drop into the 20 metres squared standard. So I would like to see that go forward from this committee. And also on the Kiln Farm application, I remember sitting on DC and actually remember commenting on your comments, Margaret, in the report, where you were overruled by other officers and they were plucking policies, national policies, out of the air. And it seems to me that we're going to be in this limbo still, because we still have not going to adopt our local plan for at least another year or 18 months. We're going to be in this limbo still, where we're, for the will of planning officers wanting to get development through, it's going to be overruling your valuable green space policies. So I think what we should do is stick to our policies which we've actually got in our local plan. I don't think we should, as a committee, we should state that, and so should P&I, because they're actually adopted, and the MPPF is all for localism, and obviously once we adopt our new policies, that would be in statute. But I think up to that period of time, I think we should stick to what our policies actually are. Thank you.
Would you like to respond, please?
Yeah, on the minimum standard, I think that the reason for putting that in was that we were nervous, if I'm honest, that if we went for 65 square metres, and then we said that, you know, that we will have to be flexible because there will be constraints on site, there will be other issues. So to have a rigid standard just wasn't going to work, wouldn't be practical in terms of delivering the developments that are potentially going to come along. And my fear was that we could end up in a situation where if we didn't have a minimum standard, if we didn't have a line in the sand, we would just be negotiating down and down and down and down forever. And where would we stop? So we took a view that the 2 hectare per thousand, or the 20 square metres per person, was a reasonable minimum standard because A, it's slightly more than we've currently got in any case in terms of the total figure, and we felt that it gave us the prospect of providing what we thought was the minimum requirement in terms of types of open space that would be acceptable. But I mean, I was pleased, at the last committee that you were talking about the expected standard is the starting point, and there would have to be a very good reason for us to come down from that, and that would have to be justified by the developer or accepted by us because of the particular site issues, that there's a huge park right next to the site, and more than adequate space. So yeah, that's the reason for the minimum standard. The wards assessment, I mean, when I'm assessing a development and the amount of open space that's required, I have to admit I don't think about which ward it's necessarily in. I'm looking at distances from, distance criteria from the development. So I will draw rings and say, well, do we have a park within the distance criteria for a park? Do we have an open space within distance criteria for the different types of open space? If we do, is there a surplus of that open space? So can it accommodate the additional people? Or is there just enough for the existing population, or is there a deficit? And that's what we use the quantity standards for. So if we've got 65 square metres per person and no more already covering the existing population, then that's when I would be looking for additional provision in relation to that development. And where it went, whether it went on site, we've talked about, but if it was an off-site contribution, I would hope that where it ended up going wouldn't necessarily be restricted by ward either. It would be based on accessibility and appropriate sites for enhancement. So yeah, that sounds good. And then in terms of the local plan, I understand very well what you're saying about. I mean, I've been trying to use the current adopted standard myself, saying that that's the only thing that we have that's adopted. But we've had a lot of comments saying that, well, actually, they're out of date and therefore no longer valid in planning terms. So then we're left with nothing, in effect. So I think, I mean, our view was that it would be really helpful from our point of view to have standards that are more robust, because the old standards are not really based on any real evidence. They're very out of date. They're a sort of national standard that's been sort of brought down through the county to us. So they're quite a difficult standard to justify, whereas we feel that the standards we're proposing here have gone through rigorous justification and research to develop them. And it's our hope that by using these, and if we have the support of members to use them, that gives us a bit more strength in the interim until we actually get the local plan finalised.
Thank you for that clarification, because that was interesting for me as well. I thought I'd read this properly, but that was good, thank you. Councillor Waldridge.
Thank you, Chair. Most of my questions have been answered throughout the evening. I've just got one question. In terms of quality of standards, now, earlier in the report, looking at page 4 of 15, 3.2, it makes reference to quantity, accessibility and quality as a specific thing. But when it actually comes to the standards in Appendix 1, there doesn't seem to be actually any mention of the quality within the actual standards that have been adopted. Now, I just wondered why that was, and, you know, your comments on that, if you could. Thanks. I'm thinking particularly of equipped play areas, for example. You know, I'm aware of an equipped play area in Bretton Hill, which is of poor quality, really, and not really, I would say, fit for the purpose it serves. So, just with that in mind, it might help you answer the question. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the standards that are here, the quality element is really the sort of minimum size element that we've got here. So that basically says that you can't say it's a kickabout if it's only 10 square metres, you know, in size, or you can't say it's an equipped play area, a local equipped play area if it's less than, for example, 400 square metres. So that's the quality element in here. In terms of the design of the specification for these different types of open space, I mean, we currently have specifications for play areas that we append to Section 106 agreements for the developers. So, you know, the agreement says that you will implement the play area in accordance with the play area specifications. So that sets out the design requirements. So what range of equipment there should be, how much there should be, what ages it should cover, what access there should be. So that's dealt with there. And as I say, to date, it hasn't been an issue in terms of planning. We've always been able to attach that to the Section 106 agreements. In terms of wider quality standards, I think that's something more that will come through the green infrastructure strategy. So that will give us, we'll be setting out standards there in terms of what are the criteria for these different types of open space. So when we're assessing open space, does it meet these criteria? And if it doesn't count as a play area, it doesn't count as, or it registers as a deficit, and we need to do something to bring it up to that standard. So I think that will come through the green infrastructure strategy, that level of detail. The difficulty with these standards, as the planners keep telling us, is we have to be careful that we don't put too much in here in relation to the local plan in terms of too much detail. What we want is to make sure that we get the quantity, the distances and the minimum sizes, so that we know that we at least get the right spaces within the development, and then the detail of the design we can always deal with, you know, through the planning process with our specifications. But yeah, I mean they will be included in the green infrastructure strategy. Yeah.
Thank you. We're back with Councillor Mrs James, then Councillor Peach, Reid, Goddison and Baker. Mrs James.
Again, I've got lots of questions. One of the in going back to Appendix 1 on page 17, one of the concerns I have about this standard is there's no protection of anything, I think, because of what you've said in the body of the report. We're not protecting existing open space. And I just want to, again, hand something out. It's in relation to Reading Borough Council, that in relation to their public and strategic open space, they state within that important areas of public and strategic open space, as shown on the proposals map will be protected from development. Proposals that would result in the loss of any of these areas of open space or jeopardize their use of enjoyment by the public will not be permitted. And what I would like to see in our open space standard is something that says that we value, the memorial park, and come what may, it will be protected. And we have a list of open spaces, and I would expect that to be in that standard, and some reference to existing open space. So that's not in there. That's my first question. Why isn't existing open space in the standard? Sorry.
I mean, basically, these green space standards are in relation to new development. So, these are the standards that we would apply in terms of the local plan to any new development applications. But we're also using them in the green infrastructure strategy to identify whether there's any deficits. And in terms of this that you have here from Reading, I mean, having had just a brief look at it, but I mean, my view is that this type of, if we wanted to produce these kinds of protections of key open spaces, if you're saying that, can we have something somewhere that says we will never develop War Memorial Park? My feeling is that type of thing would be best in the green infrastructure strategy, which again informs planning, but that's talking about how we manage our green spaces and how we look at them as a network, and which areas we protect and which areas we may be more flexible about. Sorry.
The only thing is that I understand that this is about new development, but the reality is this new development is going on existing open space. So in an ideal world, I understand, and I like your view on new development, but we have to have a view to protecting the existing open space, because this new development is going to be sitting on our old open space. So that's why I'm asking, why can't that be in there?
I think in relation to protecting open space, that will be covered in the local plan policies. So, I mean, having spoken to full planning officers, I think the intention is that the local plan will obviously have these policies within it. The standards will be an appendix to the local plan, referred to in the local plan, but the policies will be a statement about protection of existing open space, and I do know that they have a draft policy that's along the lines of what we've had previously, that basically says that no development of public open space unless these situations. But that applies purely to designated public open space. Obviously, in terms of other open space, greenfield or whatever, that's covered by different aspects of the planning policies.
On again, the same appendix, on minimum sizes, the thing that I see changed over the last 18 months in this journey of this report is the word, for those, so it's on minimum sizes, and it's a second bullet, strategic equipped play areas, including provision of teenagers in that area. The word adjacent has appeared in that document, and it wasn't there before. Now, what worries me, and it's in relation to the question that you answered earlier, I think it was, I'm not sure who asked it, I think it might have been Councillor Goddison. Lichpit and Chinham, for example, are now, within the report, now not a rural settlement, but they're an urban settlement. And therefore they're adjacent to Basingstoke, or there are other sites that are now that are going to be developed as greenfield, and we're going to see lots of greenfield development, which will become adjacent to Basingstoke, whereas they were, or even join Basingstoke where they were standalone, and so they're going to have a lesser standard than they would have done. Why has that word adjacent appeared and it wasn't there before?
Could you put your mic on?
I think what it's trying to say is that strategic equipped play areas will only be provided in the urban area, so adjacent to Basingstoke or within in Basingstoke town. I mean, I accept that the wording isn't that clear there, so it's probably something we need to review, but I think it's what we were talking about earlier, that strategic provision will be in the town and adjacent to the town. When I say adjacent to the town, it means that if you have a development that's on the edge of the town, connected to the town, then that's seen as urban in the same way as the town is seen. So the standards would apply in that way.
You've also got that on the, say, for example, on the local equipped play area. It's now the word adjacent is in lots of the areas. So my concern, if you think about the greenfield development that's going to be happening, a lot of those sites were greenfields in their own rights, but now won't be because they will be adjacent to Basingstoke. And Councillor Goddison might accept a lesser standard for his open space in Chinham and Lichpit, but those people that in other Kiln Farm or Kenilworth Farm or all of those other areas, those greenfields, will now, because of our greenfield development and what we're going to be doing under the local plan, will have a lesser standard because they're maybe adjacent to Basingstoke and they weren't adjacent before.
I mean, I think maybe we maybe look at the wording again, but I think the intention is that that if a because I think the issue came up at the previous committee where, for example, say, you have allocated sites, one of which is at the moment got a gap between it and Basingstoke. So do you develop that on the basis of the urban or the rural standard when you know that it's going to be joined in 5-10 years time because you've got another allocation site that joins it? So and that's why we tried to word it so that we're saying, well, if we know it's it doesn't have to be in the centre of the town to have the urban standard. If it's adjacent to the town and it is either going to be linked or is linked, then it has the urban standard.
I'll ask Sven just to come in. He's asked it because he was named.
I can just respond to Laura. I would make the point that I have no objection to to your naming. I mean, I would make the point that we don't accept lower standards in Basing and Lichpit. I think everybody should accept that the standards that we have in Basing and Lichpit are amazingly high, and in particular Lichpit, which was laid out in the sort of early 80s. I think it's been extremely well done. There's considerable open space. Public footpaths have got green walkways either side of them. You can walk from one end of Lichpit to the other without going on a main road. There's plenty of green open spaces. And if any new builds on green fields can be as good as Lichpit is, then nobody's going to have any cause for complaint.
So, Mrs. James.
But if it didn't have the word adjacent, some of those developments may be considered rural settlements, and it would mean that you'd have a higher standard than there is at the moment. And because of where we are in relation to minimum and the expected, the developer is going to see those reduced down, and I would be wanting, not to have that word adjacent in there. But the other thing is I wanted to pick up on is that again, it's another question is around you talked about benchmarking before. I've got another little handout here. Paul, Borough Council. I know. All that open space, all those trees. Well, that's all right. We've got the trees policy, haven't we? Paul Borough Council, when it looked at its open space policy, its green standards, it produced a benchmarking, and I think it would have been really useful for us to have an understanding as to where we stand, and I would like to have seen a benchmarking so that we had an understanding of what our standards were.
Yeah, we did do a benchmarking exercise prior to the original report. I I'm not sure whether we actually included the details of it. But yes, basically we looked at other similar authorities to sort of assess whether where we were pitching it was about right in terms of how we compared benchmarking with other authorities, and as a result of that, that's why we put forward the standards that we did. I mean, if it would be helpful, I can look that out and send that to you. Yeah.
So, Mrs. James, do you have any more?
Oh, sorry.
I've got several more, yeah. One, I would like to know what a definition of a green corridor is within the document. You talk about a green corridor, and then if you look on the same page, on page 17, but go over the page, it talks about, in relation to the expected quality standards, green corridors and buffers. When it came to development in Norden, the last time you took into consideration, when you was looking at what we were entitled to on South View, that development, green corridors and buffers. I'd quite like you to give us a definition, because what you were then talking about in all of the mass of green space, it was little verges and areas that made up the green corridor. What is a green corridor? What is the definition by this council of that, and what is a buffer in relation to that on the other page?
I mean, in terms of a buffer, from my point of view, buffers tend to be something that's, I say, imposed on a development site from a landscape point of view, from a visual point of view. So in the past, our previous standards said that open space, recreational open space, didn't include buffers because they were there purely as a visual and landscape feature. What we're saying now is that if those buffers also have a recreational value, then we should be including them, and that will depend on the type of buffer and the particular site. In terms of green corridors, we've talked about having a definition of green corridors, and we've spoken to our biodiversity officers about that. What would be a minimum size? What would be a sort of specification that we could possibly use? And their view was that the difficulty is that the minimum size could be from 5 metres across to 30 metres across, depending on what you want the green corridor to do. So if you're putting it in place in order to protect woodland habitat, then it's going to have to be a pretty substantial wide corridor. Whereas if you're saying, in fact, it's just going to be a footpath with a hedge along the side, then something less might be appropriate. So I think the view that we've taken is, rather than restricting ourselves too rigidly in terms of what a green corridor will look like, because we believe it will vary depending on the site and what you're trying to achieve with it, we would rather sort of say that it will be site specific and it will be assessed on the basis of the individual site and particularly the wildlife needs of that site.
My only concern about that, and going back to the Lemon Land application, the buffer, I know, but it's an example, and I think it's useful to do that. And I'm sorry I keep going back, Councillor Tucker, but I think it is useful. No, I don't think it is boring, not for the people of Norden. But in relation to a buffer, they used in that example, in that development, the verge as a piece of open space, and they said that people could sit and play on that, and that, from a developer's point of view, that verge was the buffer and the green corridor. My concern in relation to this standard, we leave ourselves again vulnerable to developers, because we don't define what a green corridor is in this standard, and developers will do the least they can, and we're not setting, I don't think it's tight enough. And that example of Lemon Land, they were using the verge down the length of Kingsclear Road as the quantum of open space, and so I think it's important, and that I think is vulnerable. But going on, can you, in relation to rural and urban, is there, in relation to the appendices and where you talk about different standards, is there a definition anywhere of what is a rural and what is an urban site? as to what will get the higher and what will get the lower amount?
Sorry, yes, in the original report, if my memory is right, then we did talk about what was rural and what was urban. I don't know if I can find it now, but we talked about the rural settlements and listed, you know, what they would be. Whether, I mean, again, it's something that will be elaborated on a lot in the green infrastructure strategy, but whether as part of these sort of you know, whether, because we've got the sort of narrative about flexibility, whether we need to add more of a definition actually attached to this schedule of standards, but we can look at the possibility of doing that and maybe speak to planning officers about how we would better do that rather than just relying on it being in a previous report.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, if you could consider when you're putting that together, not just the location of where the site is now, but the size of the potential site as to whether it will become urban. Because some of the sites we're looking at in P&I, you know, they are 900,000, even 3,000 homes. So they may be urban, rural sites now, but they're going to be absolutely urban when they're finished.
Councillor Mr James.
In relation to the expected quantity standard, there's no reference within that to allotments or equipped play areas. Why is that?
I think the multifunctional green space is the general is the bulk of the green space effectively. So sort of making sure that we've got accessible multifunctional green space that people could enjoy. That's the sort of expected standard. In terms of equipped play and allotments, then that will depend a lot more on the individual site and, you know, the fact that a lot of it can be strategically provided. So I think that's probably the reason for not including it in that expected standard. But I'm trying to think. Oh, sorry.
Should it not be in there? Because again, with the developer, we're just all the time in this, I feel, giving them a get out of jail free. And however honourable your intention is within this, I'm not so sure that developers feel the same. And because it's not in there, they're not going to deliver it.
I think the only thing I would say is that we have minimum quantity standards for each of those elements. So, and I said earlier on that they're add-ons. They're not instead of. So we'll be expecting them to provide the multifunctional green space and the equipped play and the allotments. So I don't see that that would necessarily happen. But I'm happy to look at that expected quantity standard again and sort of see whether it would be helpful to try and include the whole thing in the whole of that provision in there. Yeah.
In the comments, the Forestry Commission asked you to include public rights of way, but it hasn't been. Why is that? Why didn't you include public rights of way?
The reason for not including them is partly that they come under the Hampshire County Council, who are responsible for managing them and improving them and enhancing them. So they're not something that we have direct control over, and they tend to be. I describe it, but it's outside the sort of green space standard area that we've been looking at in terms of recreational space, I suppose. But I think the main reason is that it's something that is a decision that's made by Hampshire County Council. Obviously we can advise them and we do get involved in their proposals for additional rights of way and improving rights of way. But in terms of standards for new development, it's not something that we will be able to say, well, you have to provide X rights of way in relation to this development, because that would be a decision for Hampshire County Council.
Sorry, thank you. And I've got a comment here about because you made reference to large strategic open space areas, and that in relation to the urban area, what's going to, happen to the small play areas? I know they're existing within this standard.
I think, I think this is going to come out of the Green Infrastructure Strategy, because what that will do is look at overall provision, how it relates to these standards, and assess whether we've got over-provision of certain things, or whether we need to rationalise the provision that we do have. And, these standards do suggest a lower level of equipped play provision per person than we currently have. But the reason for that is that the emphasis is on multifunctional green space, which is suitable for children's play, rather than a lot of small equipped areas. In terms of the existing equipped areas, I don't see us launching on a wholesale removal of small play areas, but it may be that we take a view as things develop and as we get new play areas, bigger play areas, we decide that, well, actually, this one that's coming to the end of its life would be better as a different type of space, if we have, alternative play areas, within reach.
My concern with that, again, in relation to this, is rationalisation means that we're not going to have those smaller play areas, but we're going to have the multifunctional green space, which is now further away, double the distance, could be a lot smaller under this standard. So we've got grandparents who are going to walk children much further to possibly a smaller area. And those small play areas under this standard, we could possibly see them losing them. And there's nothing in this policy or standard at the moment to protect that open space from a developer or Sentinel or Kingfisher or whoever saying, because we're rationalising it, we're going to build a couple of bungalows or a house on that, or 4 houses or a block of flats. And I think we're leaving ourselves vulnerable. I'd like to talk about this, but I'll come back in when we start to discuss it. And that's my question. Thank you.
My view is that if it's not going to be, from a strategic point of view, if a decision is taken that an equipped play area is not what we want in that particular location, because there's a better location where we can provide something better and on a bigger scale and a better quality, my view isn't that we're then in a situation where, well, that's fine, then we can build on it. We can only build on it if there's a surplus of open space in that area. So, if that space is needed as open space, even if it's not needed as equipped play, it would still be retained, unless the developer can demonstrate that there's a surplus of open space in that area and that open space is no longer required.
Go to Councillor Peach now.
Thank you. Just picking up on a conversation a while ago now, where you mentioned when you were talking to Councillor Watts that you don't necessarily consider boundaries. I might have heard you wrong when I was listening. But what I wanted to know, with the space standards for the new larger developments potentially coming forward, will the space standards support the existing neighbouring communities and consider or influence the layout of the allocated green space? So I think that perhaps another way, will the new development space standards also consider neighbouring communities and their potential deficiencies?
Yes, absolutely. When we look at a new development, we would certainly be looking at the surrounding area, whether there are any existing deficiencies or surpluses, if that be the case, and take a judgment about the on-site provision on that new development in relation to what the existing situation is in adjacent communities.
Thank you. So that will obviously also take into account where the space will be sited within that development.
Yes, definitely. Obviously we would apply our distance standards to assess whether, how they relate to the new development.
And one final question on the expected quality standard within the 65 metres square. It wraps up quite a few items, whereas the other one sort of lays them out individually. It wraps them all up into 65. And some of the greenfield sites we're looking at, from what I understand, have real high levels of important diversity and landscape features. And I'm wondering if there's any way those features can be protected full stop, because obviously there's always it was raised in P&I, there's also a concern about some of these things being shifted off and then it no longer becomes a sort of biodiverse and interesting area.
I mean, the decisions that we make on open space provision on a new development, we make in association with our biodiversity officers, and quite often, and I know on a lot of the allocation sites, there are quite significant areas of that they are requiring should be protected from a biodiversity point of view, from a wildlife protection point of view. So those, in the past, we have always said, well, that's that. We're now looking at open space, and if it's not appropriate for recreational activity within that area because of the biodiversity requirements, then that's not public open space. And that same approach will be taken now, in that, there's examples at the moment where I'm discussing with biodiversity officers about they want a buffer to a sink, for example, and then the developer's saying, well, we're providing, that is accessible natural green space, so we've provided your accessible natural green space. But that will only be accepted if the biodiversity officer is saying, well, yes, from a biodiversity point of view, I can accept access from the public. If she says or he says, no, we can't have any access within so many metres of that, then I'll say, well, no, that, you can't count that as accessible natural green space. So, you'll be needing to provide that on top. So that's the approach.
So just to confirm it in mind, although it's in this box, mounting up for the 65 metres square, there's potential that the important biodiverse areas could come outside of this 65 metres square. So the biodiversity officer says you cannot touch that no matter what, therefore you cannot consider it in the 65 metres square, and you will seek to find that space on the site through negotiation.
Yes, definitely. We're talking here about multifunctional green space, and if it's biodiversity area that effectively isn't multifunctional because it can only be managed in a particular way for wildlife and you cannot allow any other access onto it, then that's that wouldn't be counted as part of the multifunctional green space. That would be set.
Thanks, Mrs. James.
Sorry, but in relation to the green infrastructure, as you can on this standard, you can mitigate. So under this standard, if you can't meet the requirement, what you do is you then buy it elsewhere in the ward. So you say, we can't meet it on this. Under that green infrastructure, because I'm so passionate about newts, for example, what happens when the newt, under that last planning application, they had moved it onto this site to protect it, and because they felt they had to move it again, then what they said is we're going to move it again to another site. So, but if you can't protect it, you add money and buy something and add. So you don't necessarily have to protect that species, you just offer money elsewhere for something else. So it isn't quite the same, and so I think you need to look at, and that's why we shouldn't be considering this tonight in isolation without the green infrastructure strategy. It's very dangerous. You need to understand these standards against that, and that's why this should go to P&I, and that's why we can't accept this tonight, because you need to look at that mitigation for biodiversity and wildlife.
Indeed.
So, Councillor Peach, just want a quick...
Ever so quickly, yeah, and my only point was, just reading this and from what you've said, is that perhaps if the biodiversity special sites are protected anyway, perhaps they should naturally then fall out of these boxes of their 65 metres square, because they are naturally protected anyway, so maybe we shouldn't count them in the first place.
So yes, with the 65 we're talking about accessible natural green space, so biodiverse sites, important habitats are in addition to these standards in that way. Yeah. So when I'm talking about accessible natural green space, that's green space that we can allow people to wander. It's natural, but we can allow people to wander around in it and walk dogs in it and whatever. Whereas if you've got an important habitat, it may not be appropriate, and therefore you can't allow access, and therefore it doesn't count as that multifunctional green space. Hope that's.
We do have a habit of cats and dogs as friends, and it's not compatible with some green space. Councillor Mrs Reid.
Thank you, Chair. This actually follows on pretty well from this conversation that's just been going on here. I'm going to be a bit parochial because I'm going to talk about Kendall Farm, which isn't the proposed development for Kendall Farm is not in my ward, but it's close enough to my ward. It's adjacent to my ward, and it would affect it very strongly. And I don't know whether the whole committee is aware, but the proposed development there is 300 homes abutting a very important ancient woodland, and of course Old Down, which Paul Beavers is very well involved in. And the comments from the developers, which are on page 21, 22, mention they feel the development gives scope to enhance existing green infrastructure, which obviously I would take great issue with, because I don't believe for a minute the development of 300 homes is going to enhance the existing green infrastructure. And it's very concerning because it is a very important area for wildlife. So my point really is to go back to 3.2 in the report, where we're talking about quantity, accessibility and quality. Whilst I appreciate that this is also something for the whole green infrastructure strategy, I would just like to see in here somewhere, perhaps in these paragraphs or in these bullet points, wildlife needs incorporated. I don't know whether we can do that, but if we can, I just think that gives us a little bit more leeway and a little bit more protection for the sites that we want to look after, such as Old Down. So I mean, can we add something in here about the protection of wildlife?
I mean, I think. I'm just trying to think, because obviously, I mean, in terms of biodiversity protection, habitat protection, that it's not a separate issue in that it will be covered by the Green Infrastructure Strategy. But in terms of these standards, biodiversity is protected through, as you're probably aware, national legislation and other policies. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of whether we need to refer to wildlife more within these standards. I mean, I know, because I did have the note from Paul Beavers, and that's obviously an issue that he's raised a lot, that he would rather see wildlife have a higher profile within some of the description, and I think in relation to some of his comments, I think, I mean, because he comments about green corridor here, where we've said that open space types includes rivers, canals, transport corridors, cycleways, and we've said rights of way, the primary purpose to provide walking, cycling and horse riding, and he's asked that it should be changed to give wildlife a more equal recognition within that. And I mean, my feeling at the moment, and we'll need to discuss it as officers, but I mean, my feeling is at the moment is that I don't see any reason why we can't change the wording to reflect the fact that wildlife, because we've said that the primary function is walking, cycling, but also wildlife migration. Now, if we can reword that, then that obviously puts wildlife on a more even footing with those other activities. So, I think things like that, I'm quite happy that we can address. But as I say, in terms of the specific standards and the way that the planning process works in protecting biodiversity and important habitats, I think that is covered elsewhere in the legislation and in policy, and will be picked up in the Green Infrastructure Strategy. These standards tend to be, or they are, about recreational open space. So I mean, Paul's mentioned there's too much emphasis on people and not enough on wildlife. But I think that's the nature of these standards, is that it is about providing open space, recreational open space for the new residents of these developments, making sure that their needs are met, including access to naturalistic green space. I think in terms of the needs of wildlife, and as Paul said, if you've got particular important wildlife habitats, particular species that you want to protect, then that is dealt with through the biodiversity legislation and planning process in that way.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I completely follow what you're saying. I do understand, but I'm still concerned that when you have a developer talking about enhancing the infrastructure by throwing 300 houses and nature and woodland and so on, we need a little bit more protection, and I just don't see any reason why we couldn't incorporate something, either within our comments or perhaps maybe a recommendation at the end, which just gives it a little bit more leeway to come back to the developer and say, no, this is part of our green standards, our open space standards, and you cannot say that because Kennel Farm is next to a sink in the nature and woodland, and that gives you an open space that is available to the residents. We need a bit more protection. I don't know how the rest of the committee feel about that, but yeah. So maybe we can add something.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can take that away and look at it, and it may well be that we add something in, where we talk about the flexibility things, or how do we describe how we would actually cover that area, explain to developers that we're not counting high quality, protected habitats as recreational open space. Yeah.
I had a comment right at the beginning. Although I don't want these diluted and been flexible, I do want flexibility for other species apart from man, because as you said, this is done for the human person. If we look at other species and networking the green areas, then we need more flexibility, but I don't really want to dilute this paper to give flexibility to move the green areas around for wildlife. So there is an issue there, but hopefully somewhere it can be coped in the paper. Right, Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. Three very quick points, if I may. First of all, with respect to Councillor Watts, not terribly keen on the word expected. There's nothing compulsory about expected. I'd much rather the word minimum was emphasised and strengthened up as far as possible. Talking about green corridors, I think the particularly ones put in for the benefit of wildlife. I mean, the one that's been put in recently on Basingstoke Common, linking up the Fen and Crabtree, is highly successful in my view, but because it's in the middle of what can be described as a multi-purpose recreational area, and yet it is fenced off and there's no access to either people or dogs into it, so that any wildlife wishing to cross the common is substantially protected from people. The only other thing I'd like to ask, if I may, is if you'd like to comment on 18 of 23. I mean, I understand up here it says such variation will be solely at the discretion of the council and in any event will not fall below the minimum quantity standard, but where you have your viability, for example, and other council priorities, for example, the way they read, whether the requirements of green space to meet the expected standards results in development not being financially viable, that all seems like a bit of an open door to developers to ask for to be let off any particular. I don't know whether the officer would like to comment on that, or do they feel that they can make it strong enough so that doesn't happen? Oops, I'm sorry.
I mean, the situation at the moment is, as I said earlier, I think that my comments on open space and requirements for open space on a new development are part of the planning discussion, and they're all thrown into the pot, obviously, when it comes to deciding on, whether to go ahead with approve an application. And in the past, certainly, planners, developers have come back and said, well, if we have to provide this open space, then the development will be unviable and therefore we can't possibly do it. And if that happens, then the planning officers will sort of pursue that with them, and they have to provide evidence, and there's a process to go through to establish is that the case or not. And it is all part of the planning process, so weighing up all the different scenarios.
Councillor Mrs Baker, please.
Do we really have to allow for, in our calculations, access to parks by car? Because that really, is not, when you're looking at 5.5 kilometres away by car, I thought it's actually quite hard in a lot of the borough to find anywhere that's beyond the 5.5 kilometres in one direction or another from a car, by car. So do we really have to allow for that, and how would that work is one question. I'd like to go back to a question I was asking earlier about capacity of existing green spaces, and pick up the point that Paul Beavers was making about skylarks. And how do you assess whether an existing piece of open space is at its capacity for the number of users of that space? Are there any norms or any standards? And without being flippant, we have teenagers in the rural area as well. And so, although there is only a reference to including provision for teenagers against minimums for sites adjacent to Basingstoke, but where appropriate, I hope that won't prevent getting some provision for teenagers in smaller scale in the rural areas as well.
In terms of the provision for teenagers, neighbourhood equipped play areas normally have some provision for teenagers. So I accept that the wording here is possibly misleading, and maybe we should be including under neighbourhood equipped play areas, including provision for teenagers. So both of those types would have provision for older children and teenagers. It's only the local equipped play areas that would only be providing up to about age 10 or 11. And then, sorry, and the capacity issue, I mean, in terms of what's the maximum capacity of access in relation to wildlife, I think that's something that we would be looking to our biodiversity officers to tell us, what do they think is reasonable access in relation to protecting particular species and habitats. In terms of what's the capacity, for example, the example of Kennel Farm, I suspect what the developer is saying is that, well, you've got open space there, our new residents can use that open space that's already existing, we'll just give you some money to spend on it. I mean, the response to that is basically to use the standards that we have here, and certainly with Kennel Farm you've got a big development where you could provide on-site open space. So you'd have to assess what's the existing open space, what's the existing population within that distance criteria, have you got sufficient now, or have you got too many people already using that open space, in which case you need to provide additional open space or you need to provide additional protection. But the wildlife aspect, I think, is something that we would defer to our biodiversity officers in terms of, can there be any access and still protect this particular species, or do you need to restrict access completely? So we'd be guided by them in terms of, is it available as recreational space or is it not? Sorry, access by car. I think the reason it's there is, I mean, what some parks are parks such as Royal Park, Eastrop Park, where we would be hoping that people would be using it from across the borough. We see them as a borough facility, so we anticipate that people may be coming by car. So I suppose that's why it's referenced in there. Whether it should be, I mean, I suppose that the issue is that the 900 metres is the minimum distance to a park. And going up if you're walking. So I mean, I'm trying to think how I suppose what we're saying is that ideally everybody will be 15 minutes, 900 metres walking from a park. Now there may be circumstances where that's not feasible, and therefore, we might have to expect people to cycle. We may even have to expect people to travel by car, and that those are the reasonable distances if people are using that type of transport. But I don't know if that helps you at all.
I don't think it pleases me.
No. I mean, maybe we can look at, how we approach the car access to parks issue. I mean, I don't know, whether we need it in there, or, I suppose it's sort of trying to predict what the circumstances are going to be that we're faced with in terms of what we can ask for and how we can justify taking, for example, if we have to take an off-site contribution, how do we justify that if there isn't anything within 900 metres? Can we take an off-site contribution for park? And we would say, well, yes, because if they're cycling or going by car, we can take an off-site contribution for a park that's up to 5.5 kilometres away. So I think that's the rationale about using that, and accepting that, parks are something that people will travel a distance to, as opposed to kickabout or local play area where people, won't accept to travel. And I think, again, these distance criteria come from, the LONA, and they are based on consultations, with the public, saying, well, if you went to a park, how far would you be prepared to go? So that's where they've come from. And I think they will be helpful in ensuring that we can still take contributions, for example, for parks that may be quite a distance away from the development, on the basis that we argue that those residents will actually use that park, even if they can only get to it by car.
Councillor Mrs James, back with you.
Mine is, Chair, I'd like to recommend that we reject this proposed green space standard. I have concerns that it's not going to P&I. You tell us it's because of the workload of that committee, but as a member of P&I, no.
Could I remind you we're still in questions, please, for the time being?
Okay, I'll wait until I get to a comment.
Thank you. Councillor Goddison.
Well, sorry, I was really responding to what Councillor James was proposing, or intends to propose at some point, and I just feel that before we make a decision on that point, we need to ask the portfolio holder what would be the effect of us sending this back, or to be redone, or whatever.
Without cutting you off, Sven,
Okay.
sorry, I haven't cut you off. Can we've got the debate session still to go, and the portfolio holder is still sat with us, and he's welcome to join in should he choose. And I hope he does later. Right, any more questions? If we're finished with questions, Councillor Mrs. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
As I was saying, I would like to see this withdrawn, this paper. I think there's lots of concerns from lots of members around the table. I don't think anybody's happy with it as it stands. I don't wish to see it recommended to Cabinet and in isolation. I don't think it needs to form part of the infrastructure strategy, and the two need to go side by side to Cabinet. And I think it's dangerous for us to recommend this to Cabinet, and this goes in isolation to the actual strategy. I think in relation to thresholds, we've seen an increase in the threshold. So we've seen a reduced standard by this borough. We've seen the word expected, and in relation to into the standard, and we know in relation to the whole issue of and we know in relation to the whole issue of fireability in relation to any new development, that there's lots of get-outs in relation to 106 at the moment. I think that all of us across the whole borough will see a reduction in green open space. I know that's not the intention of this officer, but this officer, in her professional capacity, gave an opinion on a site which would have been a material consideration that you could have turned it down on, but that by another department, which is the planning department, rejected and didn't listen to that. And so however honourable or however this is wanted to achieve a higher standard, I don't think against a developer we're going to see that. So I ask us that we do not recommend, we reject this tonight, and that and in rejecting it, any future standard must go to P&I, which informs policy in relation to the local plan. But I also, one of the other concerns I have is a lot of the comments from the public haven't been included into the body of the report, and there's aspects of this report that are missing, so it isn't in, because it's part of another part of the report, which is part of the green infrastructure strategy. So again, I'm concerned that aspects are missing because that informs something else. But when you're looking at open space, as Councillor Peach has said, he was looking at biodiversity. We've had members of the public talking about biodiversity and wildlife. But this is in isolation tonight, and I think that we need to think about it as a whole. So I urge us not to accept this, because I think we, across party, I think we all have a commitment to protecting open space, and I don't think that this policy and this standard is actually protecting existing open space. And I think a lot of existing open space is going to become development in the future. And as you have said, Councillor Reid, we're going to see sites that are open green fields at the moment are going to become development. And I think as a result of this policy here tonight and this standard, you will be seeing a lower standard of open space on those developments, and areas that you want to protect that won't be protected. And developers are not going to protect those spaces, and we're going to give them a get out of jail free. So please, I urge you, reject this recommendation.
Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I would agree with Councillor James. You know, I think lots of us have quite a number of concerns about this paper. I don't know whether it was an accurate statement. I'm sure it probably was. No, Councillor James doesn't normally make inaccurate statements, but I was interested to hear say that this committee, you know, can't inform policy, that to go into the policy would have to go to P&I. So I would like to ask the portfolio holder if he could, A, and one, clarify that position for us, and B, and two, you know, whether he would say to us what the effect of delays might have. I mean, my own personal preference would be that we sit here and tighten up all the minimum standards to a point which we all find acceptable. But then if that can't become policy anyway, or you know, then it's all rather pointless. But the portfolio holder will be able to tell us whether a recommendation from us to the cabinet would be deemed as forming policy, or whether it would have to go to P&I. Thank you.
I invite the portfolio holder to come forward if you'd like to.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm first conscious that this work is one of those, and there are many of them in this council, that cross from one portfolio to another, and it does cross between my own portfolio, Councillor Still's portfolio, which covers the parks and open spaces, and then Councillor Sherlock's portfolio on planning as well. So I'm going to speak very much from my own portfolio, and also give a little bit of advice. We have to remember as an overview committee that this is not the final choice. Decisions in the form of council we have are either at cabinet or at full council level. And one of the reasons cabinet members come to overview committees is rightly to pick up the feedback from the committee, which the officers do too. And then that will come through, and then any council member, of course, is also entitled to come to cabinet and speak at cabinet or speak at full council wherever the decision is being made. I think it is right that the standards came to this committee, and to be honest, The reason I think it's right because standards came to this committee is we have had a very long and detailed discussion around the standards tonight. And I think it's appropriate to have that. It is a very important topic, but we've certainly delved into it in great depth. I fear with the other issues going on at P&I, this could have been one of those papers that had 15 to 20 minutes discussion at it. We wouldn't have gone into it as a council in its great depth because they have other issues that they're covering as well. Now, the local plan has been said, I think, by all members from all parties, is one of those things that you could say that anything this council does in the next 20 years is dependent on the local plan. And if we took that attitude, we may as well just call P&I committee the council and throw everything at them. So there will be things that go to other committees that feed into the local plan. And that's probably right, and it's probably the best thing because it does give it to us. Now, what we're coming up here will feed into the green infrastructure in the local plan. I'll certainly give a commitment to work with my cabinet colleagues, and I know the officers will work across portfolios with the planning departments, etc., to see how this is. I am always reluctant to start talking about what's the planning policy impact of this when we don't have a planner in the room. I'm not saying I always agree with what the planning officers say will be the impact of it, but I think to say that this will have a planning impact when we can't ask a planner what that impact is not somewhere the committee should go. Now, where are we if we go forward? I believe that the standards we have here will be an improvement on what we have at the moment. Full stop. At the moment, we're getting turned around and saying our local plan policies are not being sufficient and we have to revert to national ones, if I've taken it from where the officers have said. And it is important that we have strong local standards. So my urging to the committee is to recommend that the Cabinet, first of all, listen to all the comments that have been made around this table, look at tightening up where there is flexibility, and come back and we need some more work done around how the flexibility is. Also look at the whole issue around what the minimum standards are, and I think as someone put it, are we revealing our hand in a game of poker? And look at that issue in great depth. And I'm sure there are other ones that I have missed, but those are the two big ones. Now, I know Councillor Shaw has already provided me with his edited of how he would like the draft edited. It was fairly drastic. And I'm more than happy to take those sort of editing comments from any councillor if they provide them, and we'll feed them through to the decision-making process. But on the basis that we need a strong local standards for green space, that we can take in all the comments that have been made in this, and I think there have been, and it's a good overview committee that can do that, have given us some improvements to make and highlighted issues that weren't highlighted before. I would recommend to the committee that you do say that this is a good start, but the Cabinet should look at all of the points considered tonight, and certainly on those two, the minimum standards area, and I think it's Councillor Baker, you said that you wanted the flexibility to be decreased. I personally also agree with yourself on Councillor Godison as well of viability. All because developers can't make a profit does not mean that we shouldn't have standards for a site. If they can't meet our planning regulations without making a profit, well, the answer is build somewhere else. And we certainly shouldn't be designing our policies with a get-out clause if they can't make enough profit. So that's my 2 pence worth, Chairman. Thank you.
I was going to ask if there's any direct questions to the portfolio holder, but Councillor Godison.
Right, portfolio holder. If the decision of this committee was that they were going to suggest that it goes to P&I presume that could only be in the form of a recommendation to the Cabinet, who then might or might not agree with it. We can't send it directly to P&I. Have we got the authority to send it directly to P&I, or would it have to go through the Cabinet?
I think, as far as I remember from my days of chairing, and I'm looking at the lead officer in this, any overview committee can transfer to another overview committee. No, I'm wrong on that. Oh, I am right on that. So you can do it. I'm not quite sure what the point of that would be, because the local plan goes through P&I anyway. This will become one component of the green infrastructure anyway, which will go through P&I. So this is going to P&I anyway. The whole standards is going, and it'll...
Can I interrupt you a moment because we've got some clarification here?
Yeah, it was just to say that the green infrastructure strategy will come to this committee early in May and then on to the P&I committee later in the month. So it is going twice.
So, in summary, you guys have a second bite at the cherry. Then it all goes to P&I, and then because it's a local plan, it all ends up at council anyway. So I would worry that this committee transferring it to P&I, A, will give them more work, also push back the whole consideration of the local plan, and may end up actually pushing back the consideration of the green infrastructure strategy, of which this feeds into. So we'll actually create a situation where this gets less consideration rather than more. But these standards are only an element of the wider thing which gets considered.
Thank you, Councillor Mrs. James.
But it may be an element of it, but it's a really big part of that infrastructure. And these are going to be adopted by Cabinet and will form. So once they've been adopted, that's it, they're there. And the rest of the infrastructure strategy will not be, you're not going to make a decision on the rest of it. So my concern is, and why I was saying we need to reject this, and this needs to go away, and some work needs to be done on it, because none of us are really happy with this in this form, or otherwise, like Councillor Goddison said, we need to sit here tonight, because the recommendations are clear. They're not recommendations that we've had from the Cabinet. What we've had is the recommendations say that we recommend to the Cabinet that, and if we aren't happy, I think we need to sit and go through each of those standards, because I would like to do that and alter them. Or we say, look, take this away and bring it back as part of the green infrastructure strategy. When you bring that back, it informed part of that before, and that's how we saw it at the last time. And I don't think we should see it in isolation anyway. And I don't want to accept this, because I don't think this is fit for purpose. It's really important that we do this. Because we know in relation to Cabinet, historically, we make recommendations, and they aren't altered. And we've made many recommendations in relation to Cabinet, and what then happens, and then we don't want to get into a position where this goes to full council, and then we have this whole debate again in full council, and then what do we do? And we're not going to have the same debate in full council, because it will be on a green paper. So you're very vulnerable in relation to. So please, I urge you, don't accept these recommendations tonight. We can have a workshop. We don't have to have we can send it to a workshop that we all look at as a full council. We can look at it, because we all feel very strongly about open space, and we need to get it right this time round.
Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a question of the officers. I mean, if it was the decision that this committee wished to flag up a number of serious concerns that they had and wanted it to go back and be looked at again, how quickly could that happen? How quickly would you be able to come back?
Thank you. Well, certainly that's something that we could have a look at in terms of, but we'd need to have a look at all the different committee schedules to see what the timing would be. Obviously, need to factor that into other work that we're doing. So certainly something that we could look at.
Yeah, could one ask, assuming that how long would it take you to complete the work, and then obviously you'd have to try and fit it into a committee schedule. But I mean, how long would it be before you were able to look to see whether you could fit it into a committee schedule?
Well, we could certainly look at to see whether it could go into a committee schedule fairly quickly. But as Councillor James says there, the green infrastructure strategy is coming at the end of May, so we would need to consider that as well.
Just a thought. I mean, sometimes when we get to these gridlock points, is this something that it could come back to this committee with the comments, but rather than the next scheduled committee, perhaps we could have something specific just to recapture these before it goes to cabinet.
I'll let the portfolio holder come in here, please.
I would urge the committee. I'd urge the committee to ask for clarification of how this would impact the consultation on the local plan, and going forward on that, because there is an element of this we wish to get into the local plan going forward on the standards, which was then comes through all the committees as well. If we push this to May, are we then pushing the local plan back to May as well? I don't know the answer to that, and I think we need to find that clarification that out, and perhaps the lead officer has it.
It wasn't about pushing this back to May. It was about whether, having listened to committee's comments, officers would have time to consider them, rework the paper and bring it back to this committee before the green infrastructure paper goes in May. I'm not sure that at the same time wouldn't you want to see it before?
From what I'm hearing from officers, and certainly you've got from us, is this will become a component of the green infrastructure strategy anyway. So asking for this to come back at the same time as the green infrastructure, absolutely, it will, because this will be part of the green infrastructure, so you've got it. And now how you as chairman and committee choose to break up the debate on the green infrastructure is your choice. But you'll have the updated bit of this at the same time as the rest of the green infrastructure, except it'll be one paper rather than two.
See Councillor Watts is trying to speak.
Yeah, I'd support Councillor James. Yes, this policy is a slight improvement, but it can be a lot stronger, and it's asking us to recommend the following standards in Appendix 1, but members around the table from all parties have made lots of comments on the Appendix 1 and lots of changes. So I can't support it without the changes that we've recommended tonight. So I can't support the recommendation until I see our comments are taken on board. And what guarantee have we got when if they're not going to be taken on board to the next cabinet? So I'd like to see some changes to Appendix 1 that we've actually made to tonight's committee before I endorse the recommendations. And the way I presume this is going to be part of the local plan, the local plan isn't going to be adopted for over a year. So the way I see it, we've got a year to get this right. I mean, what's going out for consultation now from P&I is development on greenfield sites, not the policies. We spent several meetings back in the autumn debating policies. This should have been one of the policies that should have come to the P&I then. I can't really take this. I know I listened to Councillor Donnell over there talking about this as part of the green infrastructure, but I haven't seen the green infrastructure strategy. I can't take it in isolation. So I can't support the recommendations as they stand at the moment. Thank you.
Just a thought, and I'm just thinking, if we replaced on page 1 of 15, 2.1 to 2.4, with wording along the lines of, and I would ask for clarification from the officers to get it correct. We have discussed this paper. The principles aren't far off, but we want the details and the information that's had discussions tonight put in there for it to come back on the full paper in May. Could, if you're, right, let's hear from what you've got to suggest, please. So, Mrs. Waldridge, you said no to that, so let's.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I'm completely in support of my colleagues here. I mean, for the reasons they've given. I don't need to go through the points they've raised particularly, but you know, I certainly don't want to see this in isolation. I'd like to see it with the green infrastructure. I'd like to see all the comments that we've made today on paper. And for that reason, I just can't support it in its current form. And I don't need to go through the other points that have already been raised, but the members around the room have made some very important points today. The officer's been extremely helpful in the answers she's given, and we'd like to see that incorporated in a report before we can approve it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Peach. And then, Councillor Sven, Goldison, if you want to go before Councillor Peach.
Yeah, sorry to. All I would say is, if it's January now, it would be sensible for us to, to produce a paper here which we find acceptable before it becomes part of the May meeting, because it'd be disappointing if we end up with the May meeting and we still got quarrels. So it is January. I fail to see why we can't get a report back from the officers if we've flagged up which bit we're concerned about in the fairly near future, and then if we're happy with that, then it can go to May as that part we're content with, and then we can argue about the rest.
Could we let the officers just discuss to see if it's practical to get this with basically this paper with the comments for tonight incorporated coming back to this committee?
Chairman, could I suggest a 5-minute adjournment, just so we can talk it through?
It's now 5 to 9, is it, or 9 o'clock? Sorry, what's it? Well, let's have an adjournment anyway, because I think there's some sandwiches out there, and I hate to see them go to waste. That is just not right. Thank you. We'll meet again at just after, say, 2 minutes after 9, 3 minutes after 9. Thank you. My apologies for running a little bit later than we planned. If we reassemble at 10, well, we are reassembled at 9:10, meeting restarts. To put everybody in the picture, I will ask the officer to summarise the current position and where we are and what will happen, and I'll ask the portfolio holder to propose and see whether this committee agrees or not.
Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of bringing this paper to committee tonight was to, in one aspect, look at reinforcing and trying to maintain a reasonable level of standards that we could argue in responding to development applications. At the moment, as we've noted, is that the current standards are out of date. They're a number of years old, and as Margaret has outlined, both in her report and what we've discussed tonight, is that some of the issues are not based on rigorous, robust assessment. Now, what we're proposing here are some standards that are more rigorous and robust. So where we are at the moment is that we are more susceptible to challenge by developers because the current standards that are adopted are increasingly out of date. So what we're looking to do is to try and improve that situation.
I'll now ask the portfolio holder to chip in.
Chairman, when we considered this as with the officers, we decided to split the two things in order to give this council more protection on its green space standards that we currently have. The situation, as I understand it, is very clear that the standards we have on the local plan are not defendable at the moment, and we have a case of that. And we're getting told that we have to revert to national standards. So that's why we split the papers, to try and get some local standards in now to give us a better defence against developers. As I've already said, I note your comments, and I think the committee has shed some very good light on it, primarily about does the minimum relieve our poker hand, so as to speak, the decrease in flexibility we want, the issues around viability shouldn't be an excuse for not to do it, and there's other ones as well. I think I would be worried for this council that we couldn't take a decision as quickly as possible on the standards and leave ourselves in a position we have to default to national standards. And that is my concern. What I would suggest is, as this becomes part of the green infrastructure strategy, which comes back to you in May, and then the green infrastructure strategy goes up to Cabinet after that, we actually have a way forward here. And that is, you as a committee do some recommendation which says Cabinet note all of our points. In March, we take a decision around the green space strategy. We acknowledge that one might be an interim decision. I hope that's not a technical term, but we acknowledge now that the officers will do more work on this for May as part of the green infrastructure strategy, and then the decision can be improved upon when that goes through the decision cycle in May. I think that what gives you is two things. One, it gives you a better defence now than what we currently have and what the officer has just said. With regard to, we would have some local standards rather than just using national. And it allows this committee to relook at the whole issue in May, and Cabinet to relook at the whole issue in May, and make whatever improvements are seen fit at that stage. So, your choice of relooking at this is not delayed in any time. We're giving a commitment this will come back in May. However, by doing this as an interim thing, what we are saying is that we get some local standards now that we can then work with developers and show that we have some local standards rather than going through to national. That would be what I would urge the committee to consider.
Councillor Goddison.
Yeah, I've heard what the portfolio said. I'm just curious. Is Robert saying that if we endorse these recommendations, that they then become part of policy? Because surely they're not. I mean, they're not going to become part of policy until after the July meeting, when the cabinet endorses whatever's been decided at the July meeting. I mean, are we able to use this with developers between now and July? Thank you.
My understanding is that once the cabinet would take a decision on the green space strategy, we can start to use them. So we would be able to use these between the March cabinet and forward from that. But and I think the lead officer is nodding her head on that, and that's why I say this gives us more protection now, quickly, and doesn't leave the council open.
As Councillor Donnella said, it would be an interim decision in March, and the recommendation could include all of the concerns that you've had that go forward with that decision as an interim decision to be worked on to come back with a revised position for the infrastructure strategy paper in May. So your major concerns around the wildlife and habitat, the minimum and expected standards versus viability, the flexibility maybe suggesting a worsening position or worsening, all of those things can be considered between the March and the May dates. Those comments can be included for the Cabinet when they make their interim decision in March. That's what's being suggested, if that's helpful.
Councillor Peach?
I think, to be honest with you, I'd like to speak in favour of doing that approach. The reason, whether I'm right or wrong, or I've got to take the advice I've been given, and it would worry me that if we did reject it, and do you know what I think everybody has exactly the same concern. So I definitely appreciate that. But I think if we kick this one out now, we could delay things and potentially open ourselves up to more risk. So I do have a feeling, as you say, if it's an interim decision and it comes back together with the other document, and we still going to have the opportunity to see the recommendations more to the point, our comments that we've made, that are that everything's been taken on board and taken into account, we're still going to get another opportunity to then tighten that up at a later date. So for me, it's not a closed book. It's at least certainly tightening up a little bit on what we've got at the moment. So for me, it seems sensible.
Thank you. Councillor Baker?
Thank you. I think that this evening's debate has been very, very interesting. We've all looked and thought about this a lot. We have immense confidence in our officers, and we've had a great deal of information and advice from them this evening, for which we're very grateful for. And I think our problem is that many of us have seen some very difficult planning applications and foresee future difficult planning applications. And so our concerns is probably more with the development industry rather than with the advice that we're getting from our officers. Or are we just cynical, bitter and twisted? Yes. I did have concern that the recommendation as printed in the paper is probably beyond the powers of the committee in the first place, because as an overview committee, all we're doing is overviewing and making recommendations that go to Cabinet. Could I ask, please, if Cabinet adopt these standards as explicitly interim standards, any feeling from our officers as to how vulnerable that would be? And I hope that perhaps we might be able to have some information between March and May before the green infrastructure paper comes back, so that we can, you know, if we can foresee that there are still things in it that we're unhappy with, that we can try and deal with those before the May meeting. So appreciate some guidance on that, please.
Could the officers respond to that?
It needs both of us. Yeah, I think what we were suggesting was that if the recommendations that are in the paper tonight were adopted with the concerns logged that you have, so as when Cabinet make their interim decision, they're mindful of all of these concerns that you have, which can then be worked on between March and May. That gives the position that officers here have explained, that we have no robust position to defend our open space standards at the moment. At least they'd have that from March going forward, and then between March and May there would be the opportunity to tighten the standards in relation to the comments that have been made tonight, ready for the infrastructure paper in May. Does that help?
I have a list of people: Councillor Watts, James, Waldridge and Goddison. Did you want to add anything? Councillor Watts, please.
Chair, I would probably support that way forward if I knew it was correct. I would like some sort of legal advice, basically, whether this standalone policy can be adopted, used in planning applications without the adoption of the local plan. And I just wonder if an officer here can answer that question.
That's a good question. Let's ask an officer.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't give you a categoric answer to that this evening. I'll have to take legal advice.
Experience, I don't think we can just adopt this in the cabinet, or can use it development control, use this interim policy without the adoption of the local plan.
I think there's a little bit of confusion here. The recommendations from this committee will go to Cabinet. They will make their decision as they see fit. From that point onwards, that adopted position can be used. Yeah, because that would have been the position from this evening, irrespective of the concerns anyway.
As I understand it, and I'm not a planner, the green space measures aren't actually a planning policy. They're a policy of this council, and once we have those agreed through the council procedures, our council officers can then advise the planning department that this planning application doesn't abide by our council policies around green space. And that's where my concern is, that we're tying our hands of our officers and not giving them enough. Now, that's my understanding. It is disappointing we shouldn't have a planner here, and it's something we need to work on for forthcoming committees to make sure that there is one, so we can get that perspective. And I totally reflect that. Just a comment, Chairman, if you'll allow me, around what the Cabinet would do, is I think we would, and I'd be working with officers to come up with a form of words which was as robust as we could make it. Because we all have a cross-party interest, I think, for getting the best for the borough and having the strongest negotiating position. It would be, we would make a decision, having reflected upon all the points made at this committee. They will not be ignored. They will be, the decision will be made reflecting on all the issues you have brought up at this committee. And then we would say as well, we will re-look at the decision as we're doing the larger piece of work on the green infrastructure strategy, which is timetabled for May. So we wouldn't say this is an interim decision, because I think that might be dangerous. But that would be as I'm starting to formulate what we'd be deciding, it would be, we make a decision which would be informed upon everything that's been said tonight, as it should be. And secondly, we would say, as the last point, and we'll re-look at this as part of the wider green infrastructure strategy, which is timetable 4. And certainly Cabinet's made decisions like that going forward. In the past.
Councillor Mrs James.
We're in January, we're at the end of January, we have another meeting in February, we could timetable a meeting at any stage within a very short period of time to look at this. In that time we can get some advice, some legal advice to be clear of this. If we rush this through tonight, we're accepting something that is of a lower standard than what we want. In relation to the maximum distance thresholds, it's half of the distance in walking than we have now. And I could go through the whole of that appendices and pick it apart. I am not prepared to accept, and I will not be supporting these recommendations because they aren't worthy of supporting at this stage. And I think that the report needs to reflect our concerns. And if we accept it now in this stage, I think it's dangerous. And we need to expect more from our cabinet members in bringing forward a paper. And this needs to go away and they need to come back and make those changes. Members of the public have raised concerns. We've all had concerns about this. And we need to have a paper that we are comfortable to support. This is an area that we're really concerned about. And in relation to saved policies, we have a policy in relation to open space. We have it in relation to the local plan. If there was a will, because we had an officer who wanted to turn it down on one of the recent applications, we could have done it. It would have strengthened our arguments in relation to our appeal, but we didn't do that. Now, all saved policies at the moment that we have, all of our saved policies are vulnerable, but when we haven't done new policy, and this is informing part of a wider policy, which is the green infrastructure. I'm not happy to accept this because I don't think it's fit for purpose. And I think that we need to look at it again, and so I won't be supporting this recommendation. And I think that if you do, I think it's sending a very different message, and we can have another meeting, get the cabinet to come back 2 weeks' time or next week, have another meeting.
I need to move standing orders, please, if we can resolve this tonight. Agreed? Thank you. Councillor Mrs Waldridge.
Laura just about made a point, really. I was just going to say we've got another meeting of this committee next month, so why don't those recommendations, we all pretty much agreed about what's been raised today. It shouldn't create another long discussion if it's in the format that we've all discussed tonight. Should be quite a quick agenda item, I would have hoped. So why don't is there scope to bring it back to the H&E next month, and then it shouldn't delay the cabinet in March?
I noticed the officer shaking his head.
So
for 1 month.
I just don't see why that timetable couldn't be met. So that's the point I want to make.
The report deadline for the February committee is the 30th of January. So it would require our officers to reproduce the work in light of all the comments tonight in a few days. So it isn't doable.
Councillor Goddison.
Thank you, Chair. I think on balance, provided that I'm inclined to support the suggestion put forward by the portfolio holder, provided he's able to assure me that if we adopt these recommendations with concerns, comments or suggestions underneath each one, that in fact the Cabinet will be willing to accept those suggestions, comments which the committee has decided to pass as part of the recommendations coming from the officers. And also I was slightly disappointed when the portfolio said to the officer that she'd be able to advise the planning department. I much prefer if she told the planning department.
Mr James.
So I'm just clearing what Councillor Goddison is saying is, because we need to be now summing up. Are we saying that in accepting the recommendations, or that our recommendation is to accept, that we detail, and then that appendices gets changed, and we have a commitment a cast iron commitment from this cabinet member he will make those changes. Is that what you're asking for, Councillor Goddison?
I'm saying that if we accept the recommendations, but we put qualifications or suggestions under each part of it, that the portfolio holder will accept that when it goes to the cabinet, they will accept both the recommendations and the qualifications we put on them, and that will be part of their decision process. I mean, at least in that way, something happens. If we don't, if we just go back for a month, nothing's happening.
Sorry, Councillor Donald.
On your second point, Sven, I agree. I much prefer telling planning departments rather than advising them. That's only from a personal perspective as well. I don't know how well all the people watching know my cabinet colleagues. I would love to have the mind control of all of my cabinet colleagues. That I could sit here and say, I will tell you exactly how they will vote, and I will make them vote in one way. I can't do that, and I can't give you that commitment, because it is a cabinet decision and it's cabinet vote. I also suspect that if I give a commitment now that we would absolutely guarantee to follow every one of the things, I may indeed be unconstitutional to do that. What I can give you a commitment is that I think you've made some very good points, and that each one of those points will be considered fully in the cabinet making that decision. Now, there is a formalised cabinet decision-making process, and I can't come to an Ofcom here and say, yes, the cabinet will make a decision now, and will make it exactly how you want it, because that is not the way this council works. What I can give you commitment in is every single one of your points will be considered fully, will be debated, and then we make a decision from that. I know that sounds a pedantic answer, but cabinet make decisions based on an Ofcom's recommendations and views. And you have my commitment that as we form that decision notice and do that decision making, we will do that in light of what you're saying. But I can't give you, and I don't believe any cabinet member of whatever party could say, yes, we'll make the decision now, because I think that would be wrong under our system.
Quick,
Thank you, very quick. I understand what you're saying, and entirely, obviously you can't speak for the whole cabinet. I mean, would you be willing to assure us that you would be recommending the cabinet to consider both the recommendations and the comments that this committee might decide to put on?
Absolutely. I think I think the officers have already acknowledged that we need to do something around the flexibility issues. We need to do something around the viability. We need to do issues around the minimums and revealing poker hands. And I would not be happy for a decision notice to go in front of cabinet unless those were considered and fully thing. And certainly, if that came in front of a cabinet that I'm voting on for a decision, I would not be happy to support that unless those issues have been fully considered.
thank you. Councillor Reid, Baker and Councillor Tilbury, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe what we need, if we're going to go ahead with an interim decision at the moment, is some sort of firm recommendation from the committee that what we've discussed this evening, we recommend very strongly to Cabinet prior to it being reconsidered anyway when the Green Paper comes back. So I don't know, something along the lines of that the committee feel that this policy needs substantial revision, and certainly needs a second look, and that we want to make sure that we are completely firm on the areas such as portfolio holders mentioned, flexibility, viability, and also, I'm sorry, I'm bang on it again, wildlife. I'm really concerned that we are not covering ourselves and giving ourselves protection against developers who are going to come in and look at our policies and say that basically our wildlife has no protection at the moment. So I wouldn't be happy unless we've got some strong wording there that we go forward with.
Councillor Baker.
I was going to say something very similar to Councillor Mrs. Reid's comment, that I think that all we're going to be able to do tonight is to send a recommendation to Cabinet that that they should consider very carefully the concerns we have. and that we will be looking forward to reconsidering or to considering this as part of the green infrastructure strategy in May.
Councillor Tilbury.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I don't see any point rushing into this, and I think for the one obvious reason that the viability one is the killer here, because we're talking about whether we think it's viable. It doesn't matter what we think. If the developer can show that a site is not viable, that's a material planning consideration, and they can win the argument on that. We've seen that. We've seen it at Lemonland, the obvious one. We've had Laverstoke Mill where they get no affordable housing. They couldn't afford it. They could afford granite worktops and gold-plated taps, but not affordable housing. But the most recent one I can think of, and Sven and Marilyn remember this, the Trumpet Junction, which was not a developer trying to, con us, basically. It was the Highways Agency. So it was a government body arguing that it wasn't viable. And what the irony of it is, if you know the Trumpet Junction, it's basically a large wood now because it's been allowed to grow. And that one of the arguments that would made it unviable is it would cost so much to take all the trees out. You couldn't make this up, could you? But they won the argument. They reduced the affordable housing on there. They couldn't afford this, that, and the other. It wasn't viable, and we don't have a say in viability. If they can prove it, that if the district valuer accepts their figures, it's not viable. It doesn't matter what we think. It's Tesco's again, yeah, possibly with that. It's we don't really have a say, and that viability trumps everything, and that's we're getting that message very clear. So. Don't whatever we come up with, we want to come up with a policy that we think's worked, because at the end of the day, that can override it anyway. So it doesn't actually really matter at the moment for the way it's being applied. But so we may as well come up with a policy that we're happy with, that's got the right numbers in there, and then at least if viability starts to recede as an issue, which hopefully it may do, as they become, the economics become better, because that's what they argue was driving most of these things, then we will have a policy, because we want a policy that will last the planned period, not to get us out of trouble for the next 6 months. I think that's the point, isn't it? There's no point rushing into this at the moment. Get it right.
Councillor Donnell.
Just taking something Councillor Tilbury says, I agree with him, but we want to get it right long term, but give ourselves the best possible protection short term as well. And what I was trying to propose was something that we had the best possible short term, still leaving it ourselves the chance and the possibility and the commitment to look at this again in May, so we get the best possible thing long term as well. And what I suppose the point I'm making is, it's not an either or. I think we can do a short term improvement of where we are, and because we've got the green infrastructure coming through, get it right long term as well.
Is there anybody else wish to speak on this? Mrs. James.
I'd just like to go back to the recommendation. It is recommended that the following standards set out in detail in Appendix 1, that's at page 15, that we are all unhappy with, are adopted as the Council's standards for the provision of green space, and are used in the emerging local plan and the Council's green infrastructure strategy. So they will inform our green infrastructure strategy. Now, if we're not happy with them at this stage, we need to send them back and say we're not happy with them. If you accept this, you are leaving yourselves incredibly vulnerable. Don't accept it, because we're accepting something that we don't want.
Councillor Mrs. Reid.
I think we need to try and come forward with some sort of proposal, and I don't know how does this sound to the committee? Sort of several points here. First of all, committee notes this report. Committee wishes to have the best protection possible. Committee recommends Cabinet looks in particular at minimum standards, wildlife standards and viability standards, which these are the three main things I think we covered this evening. We also want to look at the individual commentary from the meeting. All the members have fed in and have that in. And cabinets and officers to look at this policy again as part of the green infrastructure policy.
Mr. James?
That's not what I said. That didn't reflect all of the things I had in relation to Appendix 1, I had concerns about the word adjacent, and you should be concerned about that in relation to Kennel Farm. There are lots of things in that that I want to say. So if we're going to accept this recommendation, and if I lose my recommendation to have this rejected, and I will then ask for things to be considered. But I had a recommendation that we reject this recommendation, and I had it seconded. The vote to be put on that.
Right, I'm reminded, thank you, that we've had a recommendation and it was seconded, you say? Thank you. In which case, if we have a recommendation that's seconded on the table, could you just remind people quite what the recommendation was, and we'll take a vote on it?
I said that we reject this recommendation and we ask that it comes back to this committee. But at the same time, I think that we need all councillors to have a view on this. And I think it would be a very good thing if we had a workshop so we ensure that all of our concerns are addressed in developing this very fundamental policy. And I think that lots of us across party have the same concerns. And can I remind you that lots of the development that is coming up in the future will be greenfield development.
I would have some comments to that, but let's go to the vote on that. All those in favour of Councillor Mr James' motion? 1, 2, 5. All those against? As the chairman of the casting vote, and I have to say we can't I don't feel we can reject it because of the time constraints. So we now move on to another motion. Councillor Goddison.
I could just make the comment. I mean, I take the point that Councillor James makes, and I see no reason why possibly one shouldn't set up a workshop to consider all this. But this can be accepted in the meantime as a temporary measure, you know, and then it can all be, because it's better to have something than nothing on a temporary basis. Well, I think the officers have already explained that they're difficult to substantiate. Anyway.
Oh, please, this is webcast. We would like to think that each department stands on its own feet. At least I would like to think that. I'll ask Councillor Reid to read out her motion again.
Committee notes the report. Committee wishes to have the best protection possible for green space. Committee recommends Cabinet looks in particular at minimum standards, wildlife standards and viability standards and strengthens these. Committee considers all individual comments and the commentary of the meeting, and Cabinet and officers to look at this policy again as part of the Green Infrastructure Policy, which will come back to committee in May.
Before I ask for a second, I'll just ask for the officers to clarify that it is coming back in May, then everybody knows. We have the dates come up on the screen here. Could you just clarify the dates for us all, please? For the May meeting, what we're discussing. The 23rd of May is already penciled in the committee calendar. We don't have a seconder yet. Did you, Councillor Peach?
Yeah, I would second that motion. I'm not adding to the motion itself, but just because there were so many comments, I'm not saying run through them tonight, but perhaps people would have the opportunity to just forward them on to you.
Portfolio holder.
I think, Councillor Reid, what you meant was the Cabinet should consider all the individual points made tonight, not the committee should individual points tonight. I will give you an undertaking that I, as portfolio holder, will re-watch the webcast And I'm also going to make one on behalf of the officers that they'll provide us with a digest of everything that's been said on the webcast. And I'll also make a commitment that that summary of everything that's been said in the webcast is shared with every cabinet member.
Thank you. There was a query earlier that you wanted to know what the comments were the officers had. Could you just clarify whether you will get them off the webcast or whether you got them now?
I believe my colleagues have got detailed comments in relation to the specific points that they've made. We will take them off the webcast, and what I have is the general points that were made from the committee, because obviously as a committee you're asked to comment, not as individuals normally.
I am aware that the officers do have an issue when it's individual comments, not committee comments, and I have been requested in future to try and get the committee view rather than individual view. Anyway, we have, sorry, the portfolio holder.
I can quite happily give a commitment on behalf of Cabinet. We will both consider both the three major ones as brought up by Councillor Reid, but also consider every individual comment that is made by every individual councillor around this table.
Right, we have another motion that's been proposed and seconded on the table. It's not quite the way I wish to run this committee, but that's what the situation is and that's where we are at the moment. So all those in favour of the motion proposed by Councillor Reid? Sorry, all those against? I believe if it's 7-4, 2 against, 1 abstention. Is that correct? Carried. It is carried. Thank you very much. We still have one more item on the agenda. And there's one other thing I have been remiss at. I did suggest to Mr. Paul Beavers you'd have an opportunity to come back and speak. I must apologise to you, I didn't give you that opportunity. Thank you. Right. Item 13, future agenda item. Do you wish to speak? I'll ask Councillor Reid to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I will take the committee's time for just 2 minutes because it's been a very long meeting. I've been asked just to introduce this for next time because I've been liaising with Paul Beavers, who wants to come to us next meeting and give us a presentation on it says the impact of development on nature and woodland. In particular, it's with reference to the buffers, so the buffer around the development between development and wood and trees, especially ancient woodland. And if the committee is happy about that, he'd like to come along, give us a quick presentation, and then we can have a discussion about it. And the idea is to mention it now so that members can have a think if they have any questions or points that they want to raise at the meeting. But if everyone's happy with that, then...
Yes, Mrs. Waldridge.
Are we talking about the very next housing and environment meeting? Because I'm aware that that's the housing strategy and homelessness strategy, which is quite a substantial agenda item. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I very much like him to come back to committee, but I'm wondering whether that very next meeting is the best one. Just a thought.
We're just clarifying the next meeting. 21st of February. Right. And there's been a suggestion from Councillor Waldridge that the agenda may be too full for this item as well.
So, no, this 14th of February currently has nothing.
21st.
Sorry, the 21st of February currently has nothing on the agenda. You can, it's March.
I will clarify that. Originally, we suggested he came tonight and did it because the two were tied up. I was advised that the correct protocol by the officers was that the whole committee know what was going on and not make decisions who we invite without letting the committee know. Hence, that's why he was put back a meeting, because I did want to stick to the correct protocol.
Yeah, Councillor Waldridge, if I could, it was the work deadline, the reporting deadline was the 30th of January. Officers simply can't rework the document in time for that.
Right, can I just, is everybody in the committee very happy for Mr Paul Beavers to come and give us a presentation? I believe there will be some slides and there will be an officer presentation as well with going with it, and hopefully this will then feed further onwards. It's not intended just to stop there. Everybody happy with that? Thank you very much. There being no other business, meeting close at 10 to 10. Thank you for turning up. May I ask in future if there are handouts or extra information to go round, that Matthew emails us so that we don't have sheets coming round at the last minute? Because I think that Matthew has most people's emails. You can put it to everybody if you like, but having a piece of paper at the last minute was not the easiest way to get a meeting through quickly.
The papers that I handed round related to the questions I was asking. I didn't want to present them earlier because they weren't relevant to present earlier. I presented papers that related to questions that I was asking. And so, no, I wouldn't have presented these earlier because they're relevant to what I was asking on the night. But thank you for offering me that opportunity. And I think if I think it's relevant, I will then do that. Not that it makes any difference anyway, because none of you listen.
Right, I have been advised by the officers I have to officially close the meeting again. So the meeting is officially closed. Thank you.